I'm going to try and get us started on what promises to be a really challenging and important day for us at FXB Center and for all of you who have joined us this morning. Let me begin by introducing myself because I'm quite new to Harvard. My name is Mary Bassett, and I am the director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights, the host of today's meeting. I have spent, now it's over 30 years in public health practice, and now I am joining the university with a commitment to ensuring that our work has impact in the real world. That's the purpose of public health and the purpose of human rights. And I've devoted my whole working life to the pursuit of equity, so you can imagine how important it's been to me to find myself learning in my first months at FXB about the conditions of the Roma people in Europe and in the Americas, and how the lens of equity applies to a group that many of us in the United States know very little about. FXB has been the center for work on Roma rights, and this is the 7th annual forum at Harvard. I think we should give a round of applause for 7th annual meeting. Its timing is to coincide with International Roma Day, which is on April 8th. And we're really privileged to be joined by many prominent and truly courageous Romani activists and scholars who are joining us from around the globe today. There are 15 million Romani people in the world, and about 1 million live in the United States. They are an important group. We often will be talking about oppression and discrimination, but it's also important to recognize the assets, the distinct and important contributions that have been made in Europe and the Americas in many fields, including literature, arts, crafts, music, science, medicine. But the Romani people throughout the world continue to be subject to rampant, deliberate, and persistent racism. This racism is structural, not just personal. It's very important to remember that racism operates not just in the minds of individuals or as 1,000 personal prejudices, but is built into our laws, our institutions, our culture. And this begins the process for the ongoing production and reproduction of discrimination and violence against peoples. This is, in our world today, structural racism is really rooted in the ideology of white supremacy, which has enabled the whole process of colonization, has enabled the ongoing use of racial hierarchy in many countries, including the country in which we are now gathered, and has also affected the Roma. So the Roma are part of a large network of people affected by structural racism. This past February 23rd marked 10 years since Robert Korba, a 4-year-old Romani boy, and his father were killed by right-wing terrorists just outside of Budapest. Robert Jr. and his father were 2 of 6 Romani people killed by right-wing terrorists in 2008 and 2009, and more than 50 were injured. These types of direct personal violence, though, are becoming less common, but more work needs to be done to increase awareness and address the marginalization of the Roma. We also need to consider as violence the fact that people lack opportunity to pursue university educations, to enter workforce, and to be treated with dignity. So the scholarship and the Romani communities have been overwhelmingly focused on Europe, where the majority of Romani people live. But the span of the global diaspora offers uncharted terrain for new scholarship and comparative scrutiny. Has a population that was long stigmatized in Europe fared better in the Americas? And this year's conference, Neglected Voices, the Global Roma Diaspora, will explore this and much more. The intention is that this conference will serve as a launch pad for sustained investigation into the complexity and variety of the Roma diaspora in the Americas and beyond. And I want to make clear the Americas include Latin America. And I'm very pleased that we have some representatives from Latin America here. We hope to help mobilize Roma activists across continents, create solidarity with other historically marginalized groups. So in the context of International Roma Day, I want you all to know that on Monday, there also will be a further panel discussion titled Decolonizing Feminism, Transgender Solidarity, Transnational Solidarity, transgender, well, maybe it'll include transgender, Transnational Solidarity for Gender and Racial Equality. And this will center on global solidarities among women of color, and it will feature Angela Cosi, who's here with us today, somewhere in the audience, will be arriving, and Patricia Hill-Collins. These events are part of a concerted program of research and engagement with Roma issues that are centered on the Harvard FXB Center, and which in the next few years we hope will lead to the expansion of understanding and data on Roma in the Americas and a comparative exploration of theories of stigma and discrimination as they apply to Roma populations in the Americas. And finally, a better understanding of the nature of the Roma diaspora. I think probably many people from the United States, like me, know about the Roma mostly from popular culture and movies. But we actually need to bring more scholarship to this. So this year, the Harvard FXB Center, in partnership with Voice of Roma, have launched an exploratory study on the social and economic conditions of the Romani people in the United States with a special focus on stigma and discrimination. So I'd like to acknowledge Kristen Raisi. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing names properly, and Carol Silverman, both from Voice of Roma. They are both here with us today. Before I turn this over to the next speaker, I really need to say a few words as director thank the enduring commitment of a couple of people at the Harvard FXB Center to this issue. Professor Jacqueline Barber and Magda, we call her Margarita, Mitaka, have really led this work with vision, determination, and endurance. I've really learned a lot from them in my short time as director. I just moved to Boston in January. And I also want to thank the people that they've found as partners who've helped make this two-day conference possible. Let me just enumerate them for you. They are the Romani Studies Program at Central European University, represented today by Julius Rostas, Director of Romani Studies Program. The European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, represented here today by Timoje Junghans. And again, my apologies for mispronunciations. Additionally, the Harvard David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and finally, the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard, represented by its director, Michelle, and she is our next speaker, Michelle Lamont. Let me invite you to say a few words. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle.
Well, I want to first wish a very warm welcome to Mary, who just joined our faculty in January, and I just met her this morning, and it's a wonderful appointment, and I look forward to collaborating with you. So the Weatherhead Center has been collaborating with Magda and Jackie in the organizations, or at least in the support of these various conferences on the Romas that have happened a few times over the years. And I must say that the Weatherhead Center funds a lot of programs. It has its hands in many pots in this university. But for me, this is a pot that is extremely dear to my heart. And I was particularly thrilled when I discovered that this conference was being put together by these two very important scholars who very much have an eye on how to use scholarship to create social change. So it's not randomly, I think, that the keynote speaker is a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and former UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. You probably don't know much about me, but I will just say a few words so that you can understand why these issues are so important for me. Well, I'm French Canadian, and I have been interested in studies in analyzing how groups, such as French Canadians or Romas, that have been historically stigmatized, are stigmatized differently in the process of groupness. So how they come to be a group for themselves and for others. I'll give you just one example, a recent example that is becoming more and more salient on our campuses. We have a former graduate student from our department, sociology here, that just published a book titled The Privileged Poor, which is about first-generation students who attend elite schools such as Harvard. Well, he talks about a category called first gen, as of first generation, and he analyzes how students who don't have parents who've gone to college and who often come from low-income background or who are people of color are experiencing making their place in an elite institution such as Harvard, and how the university sometimes has unwittingly stigmatized them by, for instance, or creating very difficult situations for them by, for instance, closing all the cafeterias during spring break, or having them stand in a special line when it was time to get free tuxedos to go to fancy events, where you had the line of students who could pay and the line of students who couldn't pay, which is frankly quite thoughtless, but his research has made such experiences of stigmatization visible and made the university revise a lot of these policies. I have a visiting graduate student who was working with me, who's working on how poor students in a private university in Peru who receive fellowships because they are from low-income families who feel deeply stigmatized as being poor. And this is a group where the category of first gen doesn't exist yet. They experience a lot of stigmatization, but they cannot name it. So as I'm going to be a discussant this afternoon for one of the sessions, and as I was reading the various papers that I'm going to be commenting on, I really thought about how, and I'm not an expert on Romas, everything I know about Romas has come from the various conferences on Romas that I've attended here. But I know the literature on groupness, and I thought it's a case where, you don't have a national anchorage, and it's partly stigmatized as a group because it's not tied to a nation. So that diasporic state is very difficult to make sense of in a context where all nations have national identities that are anchored in space. So I think it's, to me at least, from a theoretical perspective, it offers a lot of really interesting insights, and I'm really eager to learn from you this afternoon and during this conference to try to get a better grasp at this. I co-authored a book which came out 3 years ago titled Getting Respect, Responses to Stigma and Discrimination in the US, Brazil, and Israel, where with my co-authors we compared how African American Black Brazilians in 3 groups in Israel, who are Ethiopian Jews, Mizrahim, and Arab Palestinian, experience stigma very, very differently because of the context in which they live, but also it's about the extent to which they experience themselves as a group. So Mizrahim, who are Oriental Jews, who because they are Jewish think they are full members of Israel, at the same time are at the bottom of the labor market and just cannot really grasp the extent to which they're stigmatized, although they are. And their experience is extremely different from Arab Palestinians who are recognized by the nation as the enemy within. So I think, what we're advocating for is for much more detailed analysis of the subjective experience of stigmatization, which also leads to various kinds of responses. African Americans confront. They think and they reassert time and time again, you have no choice, you've got to confront. Whereas Arab Palestinians ignore because they have no hope whatsoever. They think if there's a hope, it's in the hands of international organizations. We at the ground level are really left powerless. So in this broad landscape, I think for me, the case of the Roma raises a lot of extremely interesting questions. So I don't want to take more time, but I just want to say how delighted I am that the Weatherhead Center can contribute to this conference, and I want to thank again the organizers for bringing all of us together. And I look forward to learning from all of you. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Jacqueline Barber, and I am the Director of Research at the FXB Center. And I'm delighted to see all of you here. I'd like to particularly welcome those of you who've traveled from far afield to join us. This is always, for the FXB Center, a very special day, a day when we use the privilege of being in an elite institution to really draw attention to issues that we care deeply about, which very rarely get raised in platforms like this, particularly in this country. So we are really delighted to have a full room and to have the privilege of this conversation. Before I introduce the next speaker, I just want to say a few words following on from the excellent comments that both Mary and Michelle have made. One of our goals in having both our program and these convenings has been to situate Romani people and Roma issues within a much broader context. As Mary said, very few people in the US know anything much about the Roma, not just in the US, but certainly in the US. When I ask my students, very often when I ask them, have you ever heard of the Roma, most of the class put up their hand and say, no, we have not. And then when you say, well, have you heard of gypsies? They say, I see. So there is a kind of a very, very limited understanding of this group. And in fact, I think most Americans, and indeed many Europeans, just encounter Roma who are in the most vulnerable situations of all. Those who are on the streets, those who are homeless, those who are destitute, which is just one portion, of course, of a much broader, more complex population. So our first goal in having these convenings is to situate this issue of Romani people, Roma issues, anti-Roma discrimination and racism within a broader context. Secondly, we see issues of structural exclusion, as Mary rightly said, not just in the social, political, economic institutions that impinge on everyday life, but also in a range of other contexts. So international organizations very rarely have attended to this problem, though fortunately this is changing. And the academy and scholars have very rarely attended to this problem, which is why we're embarking on the program of work that you'll hear more about. So it's hard to find data, it's hard to find rigorous research, it's very hard to get funding to do this research. So we hope as activist scholars to make an impact on that, to change that, and to introduce awareness and high-level scholarship about Roma issues into the academy, and to use this information and this research to push the political and social agenda. Finally, I'd like to say that our work has shown the combination of both thoughtless or inadvertent exclusion, which Michelle just mentioned, and deliberate violence and stigma, both in the context of Roma issues. We recently published a report on Roma education. I won't say much about it. I imagine you'll hear more about it. But our basic finding was that the common assumption that Roma people are not interested in their children's education because they just want to get them out to work is false. And it's been widely perpetrated. You can ask any well-meaning liberal person in Europe what they think about Roma and the fact that many Roma young people have difficulty accessing high school, let alone college, and they will say, oh, it's because the families don't care about education. And our research proves conclusively that that is false. So that's just one example, I think, of many where we are trying to rewrite the story. Not just us, we're not the only ones, but we hope to be part of this growing movement. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce my colleague and very good friend, Magda Mitaka. Dr. Mitaka is actually the inspiration for this program, and Mary and Michelle generously spoke of both of us, but that's actually inaccurate. It's really Magda. Without Magda, we wouldn't be here. Without Magda, you wouldn't be here. Without Magda, we would not have had these meetings, and most importantly, without Magda, we wouldn't have had the intellectual and political energy to really carve out this space. It was Magda's determination, her intelligence, and her enduring commitment that has made this possible. As many of you know, she has a PhD from the University of Bucharest. She's about to have a graduate degree, a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, the first Roma to get a Harvard degree. Whoa! No. The first Roma to get a degree from the Harvard Kennedy School, but still, whoa. She has made an enormous contribution, a scholarly contribution. She's written a lot, both in the academic literature and many op-eds, many fora, many contexts. And she is really making a name for herself and for her position and for the work that we do in many, many fora, not to advance our agenda, but to advance a critically important political agenda. So I'm not going to take up more time, but Magda, welcome to the podium, and thank you for everything you've done for us.
"75 years ago, on a spring day, perhaps very much like this one today in Poland, 6,000 Romani people, elders, men and women, girls and boys who were imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau, barricaded themselves in the Gypsy family camp. They prepared to fight back and to stand up against the Nazis' extermination plan for that evening. Locked up between barbed wire, wooden barracks, gas chambers, and cremation ovens, they could see, feel, smell, and even touch death everywhere around them. The death of a loved one, the death of another Roma, the death of a Pole, the death of a Jew, the death of a gay man, the death of a human being. And yet, in the face of catastrophe, the Romani people in the Zgoiner lager stood up, spoke up, and they rose up. Hugo Hellenreiner, then 11 years old, recalls hearing his father challenging the Nazi guards. "We are not coming out. You come in here. If you want something, you have to come inside." We have come such a long way since then. We have reached a point when, in some regions, Romani political thought, Romani institutions, Romani conferences are not anymore about Roma, but with and by Roma. And I think that the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture is a very powerful example in that sense. And perhaps our conference today is a tiny example of how the power of trust and cooperation between Roma can also make a point. And I think that I have to say that I'm very grateful to Julius, Angela, Timea, and Anna for making this happen. Yet, our Romani communities across the world are still under threat. Even more so today, when the enduring belief or the racecraft of Romani criminality is exploited both online and offline as a weapon for anti-Romani violence, and it is fortified by fake information, fake DNA evidence, racist intellectuals, neo-Nazi groups, vigilante groups. How did the world react to the death of the 5-year-old Robi Csorba and his father 10 years ago in Hungary? How does the world react to the killing of Yanula, a 13 years old Romani girl shot to death in Greece in 2018? How about the killing of Halilovic sisters, Francesca, Angelica, Elizabeth, age 4, 8, and 20, who were burned alive in Italy in 2017? How does the world react to the killing of the 23-year-old David Pope last year in Ukraine, or the cruel anti-Romani mobs in Italy and France only a few weeks ago? Is it really the racist thought of Romani criminality that allows Europeans' consciousness to stay inert and asleep in the face of so much inhumanity? Is it the racecraft of our inferiority that consents Gage to morally justify their indifference and inaction in the face of harm and violence? Only in Italy, for example, the number of racially motivated attacks tripled from 2017 to 2018, and this is not an exception. And so I put a question to all of you here, Roma in the room, Roma from all over the world. How are we going to mobilize, organize, and protect our people from experiencing the violence, racism they meet simply because of their skin color, simply because of their Romani origins? No matter whether we live in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, the US, Brazil, Argentina, or Canada, we are all doomed to being blamed collectively, simply for being Roma. But as our friend James Baldwin, and a dear author of mine, would say, we can only be destroyed if we believe that we are what the white world tells us we are: criminals, lazy, less human, less worthy. We may be a neglected people, but we are a dignified people too, very much like the 6,000 Romani people who resisted the Nazis, or the Netoci Roma who escaped from enslavement in Romania and created their own communities in the Carpathian Mountains, very much like the Vlach Roma, who left their oppressors after the abolition of slavery and searched for respect and dignity in North America or Latin America, and perhaps some of you here in the room are descendants of those slaves. We are told that we are a nation of survivors, and we often forget about our ancestors who stood up and resisted in the face of misery. And too often we forget to honor them. Too often the lack of spaces, memorials, history books, and museums prevents us from remembering. And yet it is because of a small group of Romani activists that we are here today, and that in the past half a century we have been able to mark April 8th as the International Romani Day, as a day of remembrance and celebration. Remembrance because we remember the persecution of our communities in Europe, discrimination in Latin America, stigmatizing in North America. And the Gajo world can and must learn from the fascinating history of our people, who from one generation to another have managed to remain compassionate, not hostile, forgiving, not vengeful, and unfortunately even obedient to the oppressor, and yet still aware of the injustice that they have experienced, and they will experience, despite repeated evidence of their own humanity and respect for the rest of humanity. Celebration because we embrace our rich global cultural heritage, but also our gains across countries and across centuries. Nothing really makes my heart tremble more than young Romani people who overcome. Adolescents like Sarah, who lived as a child in Romania, and she was deprived of many, many joys of childhood and good formal learning, and who is now one of really the top students in her high school in Las Vegas. A random Harvard student from Puerto Rico who confesses to me about her Romani heritage and made me want to cry when I saw that she had lost her connections with our people, with our history, and with our roots. Adolescents like Sylvia, adopted from Eastern Europe by American parents, who excels not only in her education, but also in her Romani activism. young people, young Romani people featured in newspapers, on TV, in magazines, as the ones that were featured in the Zig magazine this spring. And Glenn, I'm really grateful to you and Jonathan for giving voices to our people. But when I look at these people, I cannot help but imagine how the lives of million others of Romani children in Ukraine, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, or Brazil would look if they are not stripped of their education, if they are not stripped of their rights, childhood, and dignity by racist ideologies, racist institutions, racist societies, how their lives would look if they were not punished because of the color of their skin and then their Romani origins, how the life of Robi Chorba would have looked if he was alive today. So it is time for us to mobilize, organize, protest, and protect. We have differences, and that is normal given the fact that we lived in different circumstances across the world. But we are a global people with a common history, with a common language, with a common grief. And we must act, and we must learn how to act together. The physical, economic, and cultural violence against my own great-grandparents who were slaves in Romania was triggered by the same anti-Romani ideologies as the genocide of some of your grandparents who were killed during the Holocaust or during the Spanish Roma Great Gypsy Roundup. We are and we must stay an awake people. Here in the room, we have some of the most brilliant and dedicated Romani activists and scholars in the world. And while each and every one of us tries to be the best we can be in our careers and lives, we also have a duty, a moral duty to do the best we can do for our people too. It is we who can together make a more forceful claim, demanding justice, dignity, reparations, and rights, not integration and aid, demanding accountability from the oppressor, not pity for the oppressed. It is us who can come with a new political Romani thought, and this is us who can show that this political Romani thought has just been born. We are, and we must become an united people. And if 75 years ago, 6,000 Roma united against the Nazis, perhaps so can we, especially today in the age of global communication. And so should we, as Roma are facing old but also new challenges today. We need to learn how to fight back together against violence, segregation, and killings, but also against fake news, also against false accusations, neo-Nazi groups, and also hatred and that is happening online and offline. As the Gaja world really use and reuse the racecraft of criminality to neglect, to reject, and to dehumanize all of us. And yes, we are and we must remain a hopeful people, not naively optimistic as we are in the face of a frightening decade ahead of us. But hopeful and persistent in our actions to live up to the standards, to the struggles for justice, and to the courage of our ancestors. Hopeful and strategic in joining our forces to stand up, to speak up, to rise up, not just for the Romani people in our own village or in our city and country, but for Romani people across the world, from Greece to Colombia, from Texas to New York, from France to Canada. Hopeful and caring for humanity because we are a forgiving people. We are a compassionate people. We are a resilient people. We are a dignified people. We are a global people. We are people. Te aveți bacta lor Romalen, bud bacta I sa stipen, happy, peaceful, and blessed International Romani Day. I'm really, really grateful, but I do want to take a moment and thank you all for joining us today. And I'm grateful to each and every one of you who agreed and who was able to be here at this conference today. I would like to thank to Julius, Kata, and Angela, as well as Timea, Anna, Mari, and Michelle for their partnership. Honestly, we could not have done this without you and your organizations. I'm very grateful to Helen, who has been my friend and my companion in these past 7 years, and she has been the greatest volunteer for Roma rights in Boston. I'm also grateful to Mary and to Jackie for trusting me and the FXB team to put together this event, which, along with setting the basics for more comparative knowledge, it was also aimed to provide a space for transcontinental solidarity among Roma, and I think you can get a sense of that in my speech, from my speech as well. But this has been really a tremendous effort of the FXB team, and you cannot really imagine how much effort my colleagues have put into this conference. So thank you so much, Marianne, Hamid, Rebecca, Josephine, Veronica, Susan Lloyd, Lena, Hector, Arlen, Murphy, Ariana, Elizabeth, Jonathan, Denise, and everyone else at the FXB Center. Let's give them a big round of applause. They really deserve it. I'm gonna finish by saying that I really wish all of us a very fruitful, engaged, and wise working day. But please do keep up the conversation, keep up the critique, and keep the heat. Also keep the heat up. Thank you very much.
So now you see why Magda is our fearless leader. It's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. We're all keynote speakers, but some are more keynote than others, and we're very lucky. We're very, very lucky to have someone who so beautifully fits the goals that we set ourselves for this meeting. Someone who has an international vision, someone who shares our political commitment to change, and someone who has great experience of successfully doing that. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rita Isaac Ndiaye, who is a member of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And as you heard, she was a former UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. She's Hungarian, and she has a long history of participation in national and international governance and structures, so she's very well positioned to contextualize the struggle for Romani rights within a broader framework. So thank you so very much, Rita, for joining us today, and welcome to Harvard.
Good morning, friends and colleagues. It's a privilege to be here and see so many faces I haven't seen for 10, 15 years, I think, some of you. And it's a privilege to be here and listen to Magda, and it's also so difficult to speak after her, because I think like nobody can add anything to what you have said. It was so brilliantly put and so inspirational, and I really want to thank you for making this change here at Harvard, because I think you are just a demonstration of how one person's presence can make a change, especially when it comes with that commitment and professionalism and expertise. And I think we are really, really proud of you, and we know that we would not be here without you. So keep up the good work, and I think you really make all of us very proud. And we know that without you, this would not happen. So thank you. And my role today is here a bit, I think I will be much drier than Magda was, because I actually, I was requested to talk a little bit about like the broader context in the United Nations and the work, what we do with the Roma in the UN context. So that's what I would do. but I just hope that we also had that space for discussion about like how to actually build this Romani movement that Magda talked about. And many of you in the room, you have been part of already emerging movements, especially the women's rights groups that have faded away, that died for a reason. And we always wonder why, and we always wonder how we could rebuild that and how we could have that transnational solidarity. And we have so many good thinkers and activists in this room, so it's not my role today to trigger a discussion on that, but I just hope that we can actually do it eventually today, somewhere in this room, and I think some of us stay for tomorrow. Because I think the key is actually to build that critical mass of intelligent and committed Roma people, because if we have that mass, we can make the change. But if we are just individuals struggling alone, we have very limited opportunities. So I must say that I'm really happy to have this focus on the diaspora, although I'm not sure about the wording, because I think depending on how far we go back to history, even European Roma are diaspora, if India is our home. And then the question is, who is in India? So it's a tricky word, but I do welcome the focus on outside of Europe, and also for a very selfish reason, which is that the UN has always been a very keen partner to Roma rights protection, but it has not always been seen like that by Roma communities. And so if we step out of the European context, it's better like this? Or I have to put it closer? Yeah. Really? Yeah. Okay, it's better? Okay. So if we talk about Roma outside of Europe, naturally the UN will come into a greater importance, because in the European context, of course, we have the European Union, we have the Council of Europe, and we have the OSCE. So the UN has been somehow sidelined and neglected or even forgotten. It was not really being seen as a key partner. But when you actually look at Latin America or the Middle East, the UN does come in as a very important player. And I looked at the history of how the UN has been dealing with the Roma issues, and it's massive. If you look at the treaty bodies, because I'm now here as the rapporteur of the UN Committee on Racism, so my committee has been talking about Roma issues in the context of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Brazil. The Human Rights Committee also addressed the issue of the Roma in Brazil. The Committee on Torture has talked about the Roma in Russia, so that has always been somewhere around us. And if you look at special procedures, the special rapporteurs, independent expert or working groups, whenever they issued reports on water and sanitation or health, they always try to talk about Roma people in the global context. And when I was a special rapporteur, I, of course, did, well, every time I went for a mission, I tried to find the Roma people. Now, when I went to Moldova or Ukraine, it was not like a very difficult task. But when I went to Iraq, for example, it was very challenging. Like, I've been traveling around Iraq. It was a very particular time in history. So, of course, I was looking at like the Yazidi and the Christian situation, and I went to IDP camps. But even then, I insisted that the decision makers should show me Roma people. And so all, like the prime ministers, I met both in Kurdistan and in Iraq, and all the big decision makers and leaders said, like, yes, we know about them, but we don't know where they are. We can't locate you and we can't help you. Now, I was lucky in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, I did find Roma representatives who came to my meeting. It was quite amazing to see them. And when I was in Brazil, and I'm happy to see at least already at 3 of you from Brazil, when I went to Brazil, I had the same in Salvador. I just told my team that we need to find the Roma. And so we were just going around the town and asking people, where are the Roma? And so they were telling us, like, you know, they used to be at the petrol station, they used to be here. So actually we just went like from one like informator to another one until we actually find a few houses. And then we went inside and I explained, like, I'm actually an activist and I just came to see who you are, how you live. And it was like 8 p.m. and it was so suspicious, and why did I come and who am I from? And so I always try to reach out to the Roma communities, and it was always, well, interesting to see how they got lost in the bigger like issues. Because in Latin America, it's really the Afro population and the indigenous peoples. So even if they know about the Roma, it wouldn't get enough attention. In the Middle East, again, they have their own crisis. So even if they have a Roma population, it would be somewhere there. And now it's interesting because the danger in Europe is the opposite, that the Roma are always framed as like a very special group with very special needs, but not again in the humanitarian rights framework. So it's interesting how we just struggle to place Roma people and the situation of Roma into the right context. And maybe just for your interest, are you familiar with the Universal Periodic Review process at the United Nations? Okay, many nodding heads, it's good. So I looked at the UPR because, you know, there are member states issuing recommendations to member states. So it's being taken very seriously because it's a peer review and it's very political. And I looked at the recommendations that member states give to each other on Roma. So during the first cycle, there were 234 recommendations altogether on Roma. In the second cycle, there was an increase. It was already 375. Interestingly, none of them outside of the European context. 270 was issued to the Eastern European group, but none to Russia. It's interesting. And then 105 of them were issued to the Western European and others groups. Now, in the third cycle, which started only 2017, we already had 61 recommendations. And interestingly, the first time in history, we had 2 to Ecuador. And one recommendation came from Hungary, and the other one came from Bangladesh. They were both noted, not accepted. But it's interesting to see that even the Human Rights Council is now somehow more attentive to the Roma issues. And I just like to reassure you, my committee, the third committee, poses questions to member states every single time when we suspect that there might be Roma people. So we ask the question from every Latin American country, every Middle Eastern country, and while the responses are not very satisfactory, like often we hear like, yes, it's an issue, we know about them, but we don't know anything about them. This is what we always hear. But this is just to tell you that they are not, the Roma people don't skip the attention of the UN. They are very much in our DNA, and we really want to structurally deal with this issue. Now, maybe just a little history. And I apologize if you already know about it. I actually have been asked by the Human Rights Council in 2014 to come up with a report on the Roma. I don't know whether you had seen it. This resolution was tabled by the Russian Federation. As always, it had a geopolitical context. We don't need to get into that. But anyway, it was a good initiative. And so the Russian Federation tabled this resolution, which invited me, as the then Special Rapporteur on Minorities, to come up with a global study on the Roma. And you don't need to know this, but if the Human Rights Council issues a resolution where somebody is invited to do a job, there's no budget. You're invited to do it, and you have to figure out how to do that. Now, if the word is requested, they actually give budget for it. So we were trying to lobby hard to have the word requested. The word is invited, which meant that I had no additional human resources or financial resources to do this study. So it was really my very committed assistant and myself who actually had to come up with creative ways to do this. We couldn't organize regional consultations. We couldn't really reach out to people. What we did, actually, we sent questionnaires to all the member states. We received quite a few, and I looked at the ones that came outside of Europe, again, just for your interest. So Argentina replied, Belarus, which is usually not, it's not in our radar, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Uzbekistan. And they are all on the website. They are usually in Spanish, but it's possible to translate them. And then Mauritania answered in one page saying like they don't have any Roma living on their territory. And we thought that much. So I gathered these questionnaires, and then based on that, we did come up with a global study on the Roma. And I saw it as a real opportunity to get outside of the European context and then try to be very UN about it and be very global. We struggled around information and data, and we were really sweating blood to make it accurate and informative. And if you don't mind, I don't want to be too long, but I would just guide you quickly through this report, because I think it does have some interesting aspects of it. And so I will tell you a few data about Roma outside of Europe. I mean, this data was already a bit outdated when this report came out, so now it's even more, but I think we don't really have anything better at the moment. But I also know that there are Roma people from these countries, so I'm really looking forward to hear your updates later on. And what is really striking is the difference, the discrepancy between the official data and the estimates. And so in Turkey, for example, the data is between 500,000 and 5 million, which is like a 10 times difference. So in Ukraine, there was the 2001 census. There were 47,600 people who identified themselves as Roma, but the Council of Europe estimated up to 400,000. So again, it's like a 10 times difference. Then Russian Federation had a census in 2010, then 205,000 people identified as Roma. And again, the Council of Europe puts this number between like 500,000 and 1.2 million. And then Latin America, there was a 91 study, this is really old, from the UNESCO. They will put the entire number of Roma in Latin America to 1.5 million. What we know from Brazil is that they estimate 500,000. And then North America, well, we have all the Canadians here. They will tell us more about it, but they say that it should be up to 110,000 people, although indications are around 5,000. And then you have Central Asia and Middle East where we really don't have any numbers. We just know that there are communities, but as I told you, even me struggle to actually find them and get some data. What I was trying to do in this report, and this is what I already told you in the introduction, is to actually place the Roma issue into the minority rights framework. Because what happens is that every time when any state or government talks about the Roma, it's like a special group of people with a special problem. It's a social issue, it's a poverty paradigm, it's something completely taken out of the rights context. And this is really tricky, because if you take out the Roma from the minority rights framework, then it means that you actually don't have certain obligations, but you do. Because if you actually deal with the minority rights framework, there are 4 pillars. I mean, it's a simplified, but I think it's still a very digestible approach. There are 4 pillars that we need to keep in mind. One is the protection of existence and the prevention of violence, right? And I'm happy that we have the special advisor's team member with us, because I think he will maybe reflect on this a bit more. Then we have the protection and promotion of identity. Now note that this is 2 words. It's protection and promotion. And I will maybe talk a little bit about this later. The 3rd pillar would be equality and non-discrimination. I think this is what we hear most about, and we have data about, like different areas of discrimination. And the 4th is participation. So if you actually place the whole Roma issue into this, it will give you like a much better understanding of what governments should do. And so when it comes to the protection of existence, it's not only history, and it's not only the primus, although it was so beautifully reflected in Magda's speech, but as she pointed out, it's about what we do today about violence. How do we prevent it? What's the role of law enforcement bodies? And what's the representation of Roma in these law enforcement bodies? And how do you build that trust? And again, what's the reaction of public players when it comes to violence and any attacks and harassment in the communities? Then the protection and promotion from identity, it's funny because we actually do see good examples, because that's the easiest thing. You give a little bit of money to let them dance and let them sing their songs, and we are done. And so I think like this is where governments feel like we do so much. But then it's not only that, and again, it's a trap, because so states have the obligation not only to protect Roma from forced assimilation, but they must adopt positive measures that promote the distinctive characteristics of Roma culture, including language, history, and tradition. And that should be achieved through financial and technical assistance to preserve the Romani language, art, poetry, dance, music, traditions, including the promotion through media. And school curriculum have to reflect the same, and there must be an opportunity for self-interpretation and self-representation. Now, if you think about that, now this is when it gets interesting, like how are Roma portrayed in the media up to today? Who are painting that picture? And how is it painted? Is it self-representation and self-interpretation, or is it through the lens of the majority? And I'm happy that ERIAC is here because I think they have such a crucial role. But again, this is a public foundation, a private foundation, and it's not the actual states who are doing it, and it should be their tasks. And then in my report, I talk about some examples from Argentina and Canada and Turkey about TV shows that were misrepresenting the Roma. And in terms, actually, in the case of Canada, there was an apology issued, and it was removed from the web page. So there were some positive examples, but we are far away. Let me know when. Who is the timekeeper?
The yellow chair. You have to be worried about
the yellow chair. Okay. Hi. Okay. Now, on equality and discrimination, this is, I think, where we know most. This is the third pillar I mentioned to you, so I wouldn't really linger on a lot. But I just mentioned you maybe Lebanon. There was a research that so 68% of school-age children are not in school, and this was the main factor leading DOM children to be on street labor. Then we had the data from Kyrgyzstan, where in 2004, the unemployment rate among the Mugat Roma living in Osh region was 90%. So even if you look outside of Europe, you really had bad data. But of course, in Europe, we have the Fundamental Rights Agency, and we have all the latest updates, so it's a bit easier to know where we stand. And then the last I would mention quickly is the right to effective participation. So the commentary on the Minority Declaration says that the right to participate in all aspects of life of the larger national society is essential, both in order for minorities to promote their interests and values and to create an integrated but pluralist society based on tolerance and dialogue. And I think this is where we come maybe the shortest. And this is, I mean, I think I have been speaking about it for such a long time. It's just unjustifiable after all these years of this birth of the massive group of Roma intellectuals, why we are not in decision-making processes. I just can't get it. I get a lot of things about like why things don't move ahead. It requires money. It requires coordinated policy responses. It needs strategies. But why we don't have Roma people in decision-making positions, I just don't get it. There's no excuse. There's no explanation. Like, I was sitting on the board of the Roma Education Fund, the advisory board on giving out scholarships to Roma young people. We sent Roma people to all over the world. I was so happy to do that pro bono job because I've been looking at all these CVs, and we had been giving scholarships to Roma people to go everywhere in the world and thrive, and they came back with the diplomas, and you don't see these people. Of course, part of it is that they actually get somehow isolated, or they get too distant from the Roma community and the movement, that I get it as well. But there are those who really want to work. And so if they apply for a government position, they would end up like making coffee. And the other thing that I am very worried about is that I call as an intellectual ghetto, that if you're a Roma person, somehow people always believe that you have to work on Roma and you can't work on anything else, because inherently that's what you know. And it's a completely different subject. I don't want to divert, but in my own career, that was like the biggest obstacle, to actually get out of the Roma rights context and be a global minority rights advocate. Because I was always told that if you're a Roma person, you should stay with your Roma, that's what you know, this is who they know you, this is what you can do. And then why would you be like working on a Yazidi IDP camp in Iraq? Why would you work on like a Quilombo community in Brazil? And it was such a difficult task to prove that we Roma can do whatever we want, you know? Whatever. And it's funny how we still like have to argue and have to prove and reprove and, you know, go beyond like every possible measures to prove that point. So this is where I get shocked until today, why I just don't see, even at the European Union meetings, the Roma contact points. I mean, how did we end up with all these non-Roma in a closed group with meetings that are non-transparent and non-broadcast? And we have these secret meetings where non-Roma people decide about the fate of the Roma. And I'm like, if I put it in the context of the United States of America, can you imagine like 20 28 white people coming together to decide about like an African-American strategy? Like, do you think? No. There are structures.
This will be a great point for discussion.
Yeah. It does not happen. And whether it's meaningful, but the political correctness here, at least, it's on a different level. In Europe, you can do it. There's no problem with people coming together with no representation of Roma deciding about Roma. There's no issue with it. Here, there must be protest. There should be protest. There would be massive outrage. But in Europe, especially for like the non-Roma people, it's fine. You know, they know what to do. They can decide on behalf of the others. And this just like freaks me out. I don't see it anywhere else. And it's in the context of Roma, this is like one of the most accepted things. And I think we have to change it. And how to build that revolution, I don't know, but I'm part of it. So let me know. If you figure it out, Magda, I think you can build it, and then I come and join you. Now, maybe I just wouldn't go into these details. This report is really available. But
we can put the details on the FXP website so that
I mean,
everybody can download it.
Yeah, I think we can make it downloaded. And then if it's possible, because then I don't like go into the details. One last thing maybe, as just a personal experience that I'd like to share, is that I did go for a official mission to Brazil. And then we had this commitment with my team to actually organize this one-day Roma workshop. And I'm happy again to see 1, 2, Dafina was there. Yeah, I think 2 people from that workshop. So what happened is that, again, the UN didn't give me any budget. There was no support, but it's like, if you want to do it, do it. And so with my team, we actually managed to like have some extra funds, and then we flew people to Brazil for 1 day. And I know it was not enough, and I know it was a mess, because we only had 1 day and we wanted to like do so much. But we actually had people coming from Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Canada, Brazil, and Peru. So they came to the Roma workshop, which was at the end of my official mission. We just added an extra day. And it was fascinating. I never knew that I would feel just like I would feel in Eastern Europe. You know, like people came with the same vibes, with the same language, the same body language. And it was all about like very passionate talks. And I think what I took away from that meeting is that they really, really want to be connected to the European Roma movement. They feel like European Roma are so much more advanced, which is true, because I think that we had opportunities to better organize ourselves. But I think we really need to create those bridges with the other Roma communities, because they really want to be part of this movement. And as I said, one of the dangers is that they are really not visible. We have to find them. We have to do our own research to find these people, but we really have to incorporate them and include them and to embrace them in this larger movement. And one interesting, maybe just an element to it, an interesting element, that in Brazil there was a minister who was in charge of racial equality, and she was a black woman. So her ministry was in charge of the Roma issues. And it gives such a completely different context. Because when we had the Brazilian government coming and representing, it was actually a black man who came, and he was like, I'm the one who is in charge of the integration of the Roma, because Brazil does have programs and plans, and they really actually do a lot about Roma integration. And I found that it gives such a nice touch to this whole dynamic, because when you have Afro people in charge of the Roma issue, there is all this understanding that comes naturally. You know, you don't have to convince the white man that you are stigmatized and you have hardships. It's the black man who sits there like, hey, guys, I know, believe me, I know. I've been through that shit. I understand you, okay? So I think it was so nice that that was just this really natural understanding and connect. And I think this is also one of the advantages with the Latin American region, at least, that there are all these other people who can like advance the cause and who understand and who support. And I did feel that could be something that would be helpful. And so I think I will finish here. I think that's all I just wanted to say on the challenges and possibilities side. And yeah, and I'm very happy, of course, from the UN side to continue the work on it. So if you have any other creative ideas on how we take this forward and how we connect and how we make this, well, international Roma movement, I'd be very happy to figure out what we do next. So thank you.
Rita, thank you very much for that wonderfully panoramic speech, and I'm glad you thought it was dry. I wonder what wet looks like. But I think your comments took us from questioning the kind of term diaspora right through to data problems, to the, you know, constant question of ghettoization of minorities, right through to this inspiring idea of building solidarity across oppressed groups. So it was exactly what we wanted. So thank you so very much. We're very lucky to have another leader who works within the UN context join us as a discussant, Frederick von Bothmer, who is a UN, works in the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. And I should say, for those of you who don't know, that one of the projects that the FXB Center is involved in, very much again spearheaded by Magda, but I think many of us are part of this, is to try to insert Roma persecution and the Roma experience of the Holocaust and of slavery into the discussion about reparations. This really has been lacking, very lacking, and so we're bringing out a book within the next 12 months, we hope, which is going to have some seminal work on this topic, and we hope with that to really address this question that you're responsible for. So, Fred, thank you so very much. I think you've got in your programs the details of Fred's biography, of his qualifications, his PhD from the University of St. Gallen, and an LLM from up the road, one of our close colleagues here at the Fletcher School. So thank you so much for joining us as well, Fred, and welcome to Harvard.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and thanks to Rita. And as Rita said, it's not easy speaking after Magda, but I would add that it's also not easy to speak after Rita. So I'll do my very best to try to live up to the passion and activism that we have experienced. And let me thank the organizers for having us over, but also let me maybe start with warm wishes to Rita and everyone in the room from my boss, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, Adama Dieng, who sends his warm regards. He's currently at the 25th commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, so he couldn't make it. But I think it was great that he has asked me to come today and to deliver some of the visions he has and some of the concerns our office works on. So before I maybe comment a little bit on the keynote speech we have just heard, and I just wanted to flag a couple of things that Rita has pointed out. The focus on global Roma issues, Roma outside of Europe particularly. I think she's spearheading that still. And some of the points she has discussed with regards to the workshop in Brasilia 2014. But also the last point, and I'd like to focus on that a little bit later, the importance of applying minority rights framework for Roma integration. And she has fleshed that out, that it shouldn't be a special issue, but it comes with obligations for states. And one thing that the Special Advisor has asked me to also address is that there's a long-standing collaboration between Rita and him. And one thing that I just wanted to add, and Jacqueline has also mentioned just now, he has asked me to relate to you that 2014, for example, for the Roma Holocaust 70th anniversary commemoration, there was a joint statement by Rita and Adama ensuring the right to remembrance and dignity for the Roma people, urging governments around the world to ensure the right of the Roma people to remembrance. And two things that I wanted to point out here is that what you have jointly mentioned is that in countries where evidence suggests that Roma fell victim of the Holocaust, governments could make the 2nd of August an official day of remembrance for the victims. And this is in order to allow appropriate commemoration. Roma graves and mass graves, including those that have not yet been marked, should be identified and preserved to enable survivors to remember and mourn in dignity. And one thing that is very close to our office's mandate and to the work we do is also to make reference to the suffering of Roma that should be included in all Holocaust education. And we have heard it in the opening remarks today. I think that is something that is important for future generations to remember as well, and especially commemoration events, which is also something that the special advisor is strongly supporting. And what you both have mentioned also in that statement is that we must realize that hatred and the dehumanization of the victims that are characterized by the Nazi era still exist in the hearts and minds of some individuals today. And I think we can discuss that more closely because hate crimes and hate speech are on the rise again. And we have seen that individuals are capable of committing violence against our fellow Roma citizens simply because of who they are, and I'll speak about that a little bit later. But we must make sure that governments remain vigilant and pay attention to those early signs and of hatred and stigmatization, and that is why I want to also focus on the fact that our office's mandate is the prevention of genocide, so we want to engage early and work on those early warning signs with you, with all of you, with civil society, with governments, with UN colleagues. And what the special advisor and you have also urged is that governments need to step up in their action against hate speech and violent incitement to hatred, and that is something that is still valid today. So with having said that, let me maybe flesh out some of the points that Rita has mentioned, and maybe give you a little bit more of background what the office does and how all of that is related to the topic of the conference and what we may be able to do. And I just wanted to make clear from the outset that in many places around the world, people are being persecuted because of who they are, their ethnicity, the religion they practice, the culture in which they were raised, and simply because of distinctive physical characteristics. And that is something that the motivation for this persecution and the cruelty and inhumane acts that result from it can often be linked to thirst for political power, competition for resources, distorted views of identity supremacy, and we've heard that in the beginning as well this morning. This is not in individual cases, but it's structural often, and extremist ideologies and intolerance. And here we can make reference to the European continent, but also, as Rita has pointed out, elsewhere in the world. And our impression is that it's very much on the rise, and this needs to be halted and stopped. And I'm glad that we are here together to discuss some of the options and how we can cooperate more closely. Because discrimination and persecution of minorities is a threat to our shared humanity, and that lies at the heart of the mandate of the office that I'm happy to represent today. And we must confront, disrupt, and actively counter such tendencies. Why is it important that that our office probably represented today is, as you might know, the office supports the work of the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Prevention of Genocide. And among his responsibilities are that he monitors situations of concern and plays an early warning role to the Secretary General, but also to the Security Council. And by that, he can focus on certain concerns and bring it to the attention of the UN. And as Rita has said, and I'm glad to hear that in certain areas around the world, the UN can maybe do more and can be a good partner. And I would offer that as well. And I think what you have mentioned, this component of building bridges, this is something that we would also be very interested in and exploring more to how we can contribute to making that happen. And I'm very sure that the Special Advisor would be willing to connect and maybe help bringing people together from different continents, because I feel that by bringing people together, we can see that concerns are common, and maybe strategies can be found of how to counter that. And let me go on and say that the focus of our office is atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. And by that, these crimes are commonly associated with the situation of armed conflict, but that's not always the case, because history has shown that the perpetration of atrocity crimes towards protected populations can also happen in peacetime. And that is why correspondingly prevention, as I have mentioned, is at the center of our work, and building resilience of societies, focusing on the rule of law, making sure that all human rights are protected, that we have accountable national institutions, and we have heard that before, managing diversity constructively, helping diverse civil society organizations, and Rita has also pointed out, making sure that we have pluralistic media around the globe is something that we're also very happy to contribute to. And Rita has also mentioned that when we discuss the human rights situation of the Roma people, we're discussing a diverse population and living on multiple continents, encompassing a variety of experiences and situations. And therefore, I would like to applaud the emphasis you're also making on the experience of Roma living outside of the European continent, that you're actually championing, I think, and we could hear from your report. And Rita has also pointed out that there are several challenges faced by Roma worldwide. Many of these issues are shared by other minorities around the globe, and they include the prevalence of hate crime, the absence of acknowledgement of the existence of the group, and the lack of political representation. And Rita has also shown us an overview of some data, and I couldn't agree more. It's sometimes hard to find accurate data, and I tried to get some of them. And when it comes to hate crimes against Roma, remains a pressing concern. And according to a 2016 EU Minorities and Discrimination Survey, an average of 1 out of 3 Roma persons living in the EU has experienced harassment. And it's far from a thing of the past. Persons identifying as Roma continue to be targets of violence because of their identity, and I'm sure we can discuss that more later. Let me just add to that in 2018, the number of violent attacks against Roma camps in Hungary spiked, including 2 murders, according to Amnesty International. Furthermore, and just last week's attacks, and we have heard it in the beginning, against Roma in Boulogne, outside of Paris, show that hate-based violence against Roma in Europe is not confined to the south and the east, and in fact it was also picked up by the New York Times. And let me go back to the keynote address that the special advisor has delivered last October to the EU high-level panel on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, where he has actually said that hate crimes constitute one of the clearest early warning signs for atrocity crimes. Therefore, they must not remain unchallenged. And I think that is something that we need to focus on. How can we counter such tendencies, spike in hate crime, but also hate speech? And that is something that we're currently focusing on. How can we better fight hate speech? I know I'm running out of time, so let me just mention that what Rita has also said. So the Committee Against Torture, we're focused on the Russian Federation as well, Belarus, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, but also North America. We have heard it before, where Roma people suffer from stigmatization and prejudice. And we also feel that the lack of disaggregated data is not helpful, and we're trying to get more on that because hate crimes against Roma people remain underreported in many cases, and we've discussed that extensively with the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, and have offered a hand, and the special advisor has offered to press governments to do more on this. And
we're just going to invite you to.
Yeah, I'll wrap up now. Before maybe also trying to pose some questions, but next year, 3/4 of a century will have passed since the genocide of Sinti and Roma throughout Europe, which took place under the Nazi regime during the Second World War. And these policies of extermination did not arise suddenly, and that is something that the special advisor also urges us to understand, but rather following centuries of persecution, and the stereotypes of the past are still alive today in many cases, and I'm sure you can speak more on this, and have been exported to other continents, including to the Americas, which Rita has pointed out. And this is of particular relevance to our office, as early prevention is key to minimizing the risk of atrocity crimes. An important step in building inclusive societies is to listen to the experiences of discrimination and to voices that are otherwise not heard, and that's why I'm very, very happy to be here today and to have that discussion. And maybe before I turn over, I think some of the points I wanted to also maybe ask Rita or you is, when I go back to the 2014 statement that we heard, and what you can share of whether there's a proper representation when it comes to the Day of Remembrance, whether you feel like Holocaust education and commemoration events include Roma experience, and how can we pay more attention to the early signs of hate, and lastly, how can we take action against hate speech? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fred, and sorry to rush you. Those were very thoughtful and pertinent comments. We're nearly out of time, but I do want to give the audience who sat here patiently a few minutes to raise questions and comments. Let me just tell you in my role as a teacher here that a question ends with a question mark, so it's not a statement. Please keep your question concise, and please identify yourself so we just have a sense of who's in the room. And can I just say that there is actually a lot of space in the front here, actually the most comfortable sitting area, and we don't bite. Nobody on the panel is going to harm you. So please, those of you crammed in the back who can hardly see, please do have the courage to come and sit more comfortably in the front. But over to you. I'm just going to take a few questions. Yes, sir. Hi, can you stand up? Do we have a mic? Hang on, we're just going to give you a mic so everybody can hear you.
Hello, my name's Arta Chonka. I'm one of the representative for RMI. One question which I'd like to direct to Frederick. He mentioned about appropriate representation for the Roma Holocaust. In Czech Republic, we know there was a concentration camp called Lety, and fast forward now, it's turned into a farm, into a pig farm. And there's been constant advocacy to actually have that recognition. What can the UN do to pressurize the government in order to actually say, okay, we agree, we need to change this and actually have a remembrance for those people that were murdered there?
Thank you. Great question. I'm going to take two more questions. So if people would like to put their hands up, and please could the speakers write down the questions so you remember them? Sure. Yes, please stand up and identify yourself. Thank you.
Okay, I am Anike Vince, housing rights activist from Cluj, Romania, also a professor of sociology. As a member of movement for social housing, we are also dealing with the challenges of forced evictions of Roma, and also discrimination in the process of access to social housing. So my question would be to Rita. I fully agree that we need to find the more most strategic ways to make governments responsible. And one way would be to frame Roma-related discrimination to minority issues. But also I would like to ask you about your opinion, how about addressing issues of economic inequalities and exploitation to broader frames of socio-economic rights. So if you see any possibility to address ways in which ethnic Roma are victims of economic exploitation and violence of economic rights in other, I don't know, frames, such as the defense of socio-economic rights, and how we can
Thank you very much.
Connect that to anti-racism and to connect basically the two frames
Thank
together.
you. That's a really important question. Thank you so much for that. Yes, final question. To your left.
Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Ethel Brooks from the Women's and Gender Studies and Sociology departments at Rutgers University and from the European Roma Rights Center. And I actually had a question to Rita and maybe to Fred about if there's been any progress, or if the question of the Roma who had suffered lead poisoning in the UN camps in Mitrovica is brought up regularly and continually within any of either under the Genocide Committee or under the the Elimination of the Forms of Discrimination Committee. And particularly, we know in the room that the fund that was set up under Ban Ki-moon is still there for the reimbursement and for, again, paying reparations to people who suffered lead poisoning. But member states have never actually inserted even €1, $1, $1 into the fund. So is there an update on that?
Thank you. Fantastic questions. So I'm going to turn it over first to Rita and then to Fred to answer these questions, please.
Yeah, the questions were so good that I don't even have answers to them. Well, starting from the last one, I need to follow up as well. I know that the Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste just issued a statement again. That was the last piece of information I've seen, but nothing since then. So I can actually follow up on what's going on. Maybe they can give me some internal insights. Well, we can lobby on that. We go back to New York and we do something on Monday. And on how to frame it, it's tricky because maybe it's more of a theoretical discussion, like what rights framework you use in these particular cases. But I think the point is that, of course, minority rights are human rights, and it's part of the story. So if you have any additional concrete rights that are violated, it must be brought up also in that special context. Now, for me, probably an equally important question is like, how do you actually do it? Like, okay, you phrase it, you frame it somehow, but then how does it help you to make a difference? And I think framing these challenges differently can be important if you can attract new stakeholders to be on your side. Like if you can actually pull in more people who are coming from this racism, through the racism lens, or people who work on the SDGs, and maybe you bring in the development people, because we are talking about economic inequalities and how to overcome it, and member states do have a responsibility and obligation to do that. So I think the interesting question is, like, if you put it in a different context, who are the people who you can bring in to be on your side? And then it might bring us to a bigger discussion if we don't have time, but it's really about how we build allies around Roma rights advocacy, and who are the main allies, and how we use them strategically. And I do believe that at the moment, this cross-social status, cross-ethnic, cross-linguistic solidarity is not there yet. And I think that one of the biggest problems is that Roma are still somehow expected to fight their own fight alone. And I think this is, as I acknowledge, I take it out from the context a bit further down, but I think it should be also in a discussion like, how do we build a movement that doesn't only compromise the Roma, but anybody else who identifies and can support the Roma cause, because just the Roma will not win the Roma fight. And so I hope today we can actually talk about it, because I feel like this is a big issue about how we frame, how we actually strategize on our advocacy efforts and who we can use to be on our side. And so when you bring in this new rights aspect, you bring in new people from those areas, and then I think it could actually eventually help. But it's really the tools. It's not necessarily the theory of rights around it. Does it make sense?
Thank you so much. Fred, just
Yes.
briefly, please.
Yes, I will be brief. Thanks a lot for the question with regard to the Czech Republic, and it is very important that the Roma people can commemorate in dignity, and there are certain ways to enable that, and I'll go back and deliver the message. I would just say, in general, to have that advocacy, there are diplomatic channels to reach out to the permanent representative in New York, for example, to discuss certain matters, and the special advisor travels to the European Union frequently to have bilateral meetings, and Roma advocacy could be included in that. And I also want to point out that in discussions with members of the European Parliament, for example, that could be something that could be addressed as well. So I think there are certainly different angles and channels for that discussion.
Thank you very much. So please let's give a warm applause to our first panelist.
If we had a glass to clink, I would clink it. Good, my mic is on now. I know everybody wants to talk with each other, and this is an important part of this meeting, but we have another really wonderful panel that we're trying to convene now. I'm going to use the strategy that my sister, a primary school teacher, used to just keep talking, and eventually people will begin to quiet down, sit down, and allow us to convene this next panel. If I could have quiet in the room and have people who are drifting out to drift back in, I hope, and we're going to be convening the next panel. I've already met all of you, but let me just use my my position as chair to say a few words not exactly relevant to the panel, but relevant to today. I began this morning actually going over to a meeting of Brazilian students. Some of you are here from Brazil, I think. There's a big meeting convened by Harvard and MIT Brazilian students over at MIT this morning. And I went over there to meet Luana Janot, who is a Brazilian activist. I think in the US we would say she worked on affirmative action. And when I greeted her in the hall, I said, it wasn't hard to pick you out. You're the only black face here. So I think that the issues that we're talking about today are extremely cross-cutting. And I looked up this quote from Martin Luther King, who I would say his radicalism was greatly underestimated by many people as we look back on him today. And he noted that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. What affects one directly affects all indirectly. So I would just say on the comment earlier, in the earlier panel, that it's very important that we not compete for oppression, that we all acknowledge that many sources of this are the same, and that there's little value to be gained in saying any one of us who experiences racial discrimination, marginalization, and oppression is more oppressed than the other. We are all, this is going to be an important outcome today, and it's going to be part of what we talk about, I expect, in this panel, because I know one of our speakers worked with Kimberly Crenshaw. So let me then turn to our panel. We didn't have a chance to chat before, but we have a timekeeper, as you've learned here. I think each of you will have about 10 minutes, and you'll start being warned. I won't introduce anyone by any more than by name and institution. Their full biographies are in the program panel. But I want to thank all of you for participating and talking about the social and economic status of Roma across the world, access to fundamental rights. Our first presenter will be Alexandra Opria. Is that right? Okay. No, well, tell me what you decided. That's my order here. I will follow the panels.
No, you go.
Christine Raisi. Yeah. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Sorry that I have that not to have re-engineered the order. I hope I didn't rattle you. Kristen is from Voice of Roma here in the United States. Thank you very much. Did you work with Chris? Who worked with Kimberly? I did. You did? Okay, please, over to you. Are you showing
Kristen?
Slides?
I'm going to, yeah.
Oh dear. Well, if any of the panels want to sit in the front
Oh my
row.
God, what is it doing?
So
Okay,
you can
hang
see
on.
the presentation, I think.
Oh my goodness. So I don't know why it's appearing like this. Do you, tech person, help me? Yeah. Oh, no, it appears like this to me. It looks like that to you. It looks different on here. Okay.
Go to Magda.
So my expertise is Romani Americans, not technical things, obviously. My presentation is on Romani diasporic connections in North and South America. Some of you are here from South America, and I hope you will find this interesting. And if you're from Europe, you might still be part of this presentation, and if you're from America, you probably will as well. So this is a historic presentation, and okay, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. To date, the history and experiences of Romani people who immigrated to North and South America from a variety of countries is largely unwritten and unexamined. It's almost never accounted for within the broader framework of American history. I was born in the US, raised here, went to school here. I can tell you that I don't even remember one time that Romani history was ever presented, all through my K through 12 experience and barely in college. So, still within many communities here, there are oral histories of our stories of our families who immigrated to the United States or maybe eventually ended up here by way of other places. So this is what I'm going to talk about. The presentation is an overview of the immigration of several Romani communities from Europe who arrived at various ports in North and South America. And I'm going to focus specifically on how these groups made their way to the United States if they arrived at other ports. I also will discuss how and my research colleague, Amanda Schreiber, have been piecing together oral history accounts, publicly available documentation such as census records, business licenses, newspaper clippings, as well as DNA evidence to map detailed genealogies and connections of Romani groups in various countries, which also show the historical routes of immigration, migration, and settlement. And a disclaimer that there has been many people who have helped me with this project. I'm not claiming all of this is my own original research, but I think I'm maybe one of the first people to piece it together this way and put it all together. But I do want to give a shout out, I guess, to Amanda Schreiber, who has been amazing. She's an American Romani Chal woman who has been working with me on this research. Todd Joels, another American Romani Chal, as well as other community members from the Calderash and Machwaya communities here, sharing stories and oral histories with me, and of course other scholars who have done some historical research on this topic. I also want to give a disclaimer that anything I'm sharing today I have permission to share, or the people that I'm talking about are deceased, so I'm not violating any confidentiality of any person. Just putting that out there. So who cares about Romani history? This, by the way, the cover photo is a photo that was taken in the 1930s in New York of a Romani Chal family. This is a woman who is, I think, either Calderash or Machwaya. This is also from the 1930s in New York. So why did I decide to do this project? I think that preserving our unique history here is very important. There are significant events in our collective past that can provide us, significant events in our collective past inform our current situations. An opportunity to revisit this history can provide us with a sense of the continuity between our past, our present, and our own identities, and help bring to light our connections to each other and to other Romani communities, and also to foster recognition by outsiders about who we are. Many researchers also do not look to North or South America as a site for Romani studies topics, but I hope this presentation will show that these definitely are sites for Romani studies, and these communities do need to be written about and represented to gain a broader understanding of our collective history and our diaspora. If you have ever tried to study North or South American Romani populations, you have probably quickly realized there's very, very little published on this topic. Aside from a few master's theses, and then there's a few regional and city-specific studies, but there's nothing really that's a more overarching examination. So I felt that I need to bring a Romani perspective to this and start my own scholarship individually and with my colleague. I think we need to produce our own narratives on this topic. I think a lot of times in conferences and presentations, a lot of us do talk about stigma and we do talk about stereotypes, and I think those things are important, but we all know what those are. So I think what is important is that we need to bring a counter narrative that is what our reality is and what our history is. So that's what I want to start doing. And this is really it's only been like a couple of years since I've been doing this, so it's very, very initial stages. Also, I want to clarify that I am looking at people who immigrated to North and South America whose ancestors still identify as Romani, even if they were absorbed into other groups. I'm not talking about the first Romani person who ever came here, but that's another topic. So I'm going to look about from the mid-1700s and ending in the early 1900s. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, how am I doing on time? 3 minutes? Okay. Because I definitely don't have time to cover everything that I really want to say, but maybe we can get into it a little bit in the discussion. I'd love to chat with you because there's a lot to discuss here. So what I am going to say is that in starting to do this, I had to learn about what kinds of records there are in different places and how records can show that a person is Romani or not, and what types of records were even required at different periods in time. Like in the United States, you didn't even have marriage licenses that were required for people until about like the mid-1850s. And for example, in many communities that are more traditionally conservative, they don't register their marriages, although the official marriage is the one that takes place in the community, and everybody recognizes the couple as being married, but you're not going to find a record of that. But you do find other records, and I want to make sure I get through this because I have some records I'm going to show you, even though they'll be hard to see, but I just want to show you what you do find or what you are looking for, because what I'm interested in also is the records that are available in Brazil and Argentina, and because that's kind of where I'm going next. So anyway, I'm cross-checking to confirm the genealogical and oral history counts using these records, which are ship logs and passenger manifests, federal and state census records, newspaper articles, records of property and business licenses. There's a lot of Roma who were fortune tellers in the early part of their arrival and in the 1920s. And I do have their business license records with their last names, especially in New York and California were big areas for that. So the other thing I'm using is DNA to confirm genealogical relationships between groups and also showing patterns of immigration and migration. And taking all of these things together, you can start getting a picture, which is really cool, I think. All right, so here I am searching for evidence. I guess I kind of already went over that. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. So this is, I think, the contrast between, you know, the public records, like I said, all of those things that I just mentioned, and then the DNA evidence. But the oral histories are also really important. Sometimes I think we don't put enough credit into our own oral histories and our stories, and I think that also needs to be a big part of this conversation. So these are all of the things that I'm examining. Okay, so this is a very short timeline of 1750 to beyond 1960. In less than 10 minutes. So the first records of Romani immigration that I could find to the United States of people whose descendants still identify as Romani was in the 1750s. You had German Romani people immigrating to Pennsylvania to areas with large German populations, especially Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which, if you know anything about the U.S., lots of Germans in Pennsylvania. Because in Germany at this time, in the 1750s up until about the 1930s, they had organized gypsy hunts. Maybe some of you have heard of that, where they would go on horseback, like a fox hunt, basically, but for people. And I didn't expect to get emotional about that, but they also took children away from their parents and placed them with non-Roma. So obviously this is a reason why white people would want to immigrate. Sorry. Okay. Then moving on to the 1830s. Well, maybe more 1840s till the end of the 1890s. You had Romani Chal coming from the United Kingdom. You guys are familiar with Romani Chal, right? A little bit of background, just in case somebody is not. Romani Chals are a group of Romani people who settled in areas of the UK for hundreds of years, and because of their how the culture developed there, they speak a very unique dialect of Romani, sometimes mixed with local languages that are indigenous to the UK. So the descendants of Romani Chal immigrants to the US still recognize their connections to and their history in the UK. But this group of immigrants was searching for new opportunities in the US, especially through the professions of horse trading. And as the industrialization of the UK started to take place, they came to the United States, which there were still opportunities for horse trading. And some of them went to ports in Louisiana and were part of horse trading during the Civil War later on. And then some of them arrived in ports of Canada and then migrated across the border to the United States, eventually settling in New England. This was about the 1850s, but you also had Romani Chal coming in the 1850s to New England as well. And then also staying in larger settlements in Iowa and Ohio and going to the south. And then this group was involved in seasonal work opportunities. So there was economic migration with the seasonal work opportunities. That's still the case for some people today, where you have a home base and then you have some, migration with work opportunities. But using ancestral records, we can trace, which I'm going to show, hopefully, if there's enough time. No, there's not enough time? I have to cut it off right now? Okay. 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to use my position as chair. We can eat faster or something. Okay, I'm going to try to get through this. So since I don't have a lot of time, what I think is most important here is that, let's see. I need to pick out the most salient points here. Oh, okay. All right. So I have the record for this family, which are the Coopers, who came here in the 1850s. And this family founder from one particular branch is basically who almost every single Romani Chal Cooper in the United States can trace their ancestry to, was this group of people. And I have the record of their ship log when they came here and their profession and their names. And I also have similar information for the next group of Roma who were coming, starting in the 1850s. As I think Magda mentioned, this was after the period of the emancipation of slavery in Romania and other areas. People that had the means left, and some of those people wanted to come to the United States. Some of them, unfortunately, were rejected from the United States because at certain points in the immigration period to Ellis Island, if you were seen as a person who could possibly become a ward of the state, you were rejected. And because some of those Roma were identifiably Romani and could not provide a profession that was deemed useful, they were rejected. So they were stubborn, though, and they weren't going to take no for an answer, so they went to Brazil, and some of them went to Argentina. And those people then came up through Mexico and came to the United States. And some of them just waited for a period of years and then tried to come again and were successful later on in the 1900s. Let's see. So those people, the interesting thing that I have on those ship logs is that the names of the people who were traveling were whatever their Serbian name was, but some of them said they were really Brazilian, but their names are like Adamovic or Jovanovic, and obviously that's not a very South American name. So I'm gonna show you, unfortunately, one other thing I did want to mention is that once those people arrived here, they went to basically larger cities. They were engaged in a variety of occupations, but you also had people in the 1920s and 30s during the Great Depression go from the US and go back to South America or go back to Central America or kind of work in a pattern based on whatever economic opportunities were best for them. So it's not like, I feel like people think about immigration as you're coming here and then you're staying here and there's no movement. And that was not the case. There was a lot of movement. I don't have time to talk about the post-World War II immigration, but there were Roma, including Holocaust survivors, who did come to the United States, as well as waves of immigration following the breakup of Yugoslavia and wars in the Balkans and other current events. Okay, so this is the record I have of the Cooper family coming to the US. Can you see my pointer? No. So, let's see. Richard Cooper is over here. I don't know if you can see him. He's 22 years old. He's right there.
Number 10, I think.
Yeah.
Fourth off from the bottom.
Like I said, I'm not attacking that. Where is it? But you can also see the green one. Okay. Okay. So there he is. And you can also see that his occupation is listed as basket maker. He's coming into New York. This record is from, what did they say, 1851. And then you can also see that he was coming with his family. There's more Coopers here. He's coming also with the Stanleys. More Coopers here. And that's another thing is that the early immigrants came in families of sometimes 10, but later in the other migrations, when you had Eastern European Roma, people were coming in groups of 50 or 60 or sometimes more. So this is the initial migration. And then I have him again in the 1870s census, right there. And now I think he's a horse trader here. Yeah, horse dealer. So when you look, I'm using Ancestry.com to find these records. Is that your family? This will give you what the record actually says, because as you can see here, it's all that old school cursive. Sometimes it's really hard to read. But it also shows you, if I could scroll further down, that his brother is here with him. It will show you everybody in the household. And then the cool thing, too, is you can also see who their neighbors are. And, there's a lot of information here. So I have more information on him, too. And in about 10 years from now, you can also see that they're living in a neighborhood. They're living around non-Roma, and their kids are going to school, which was pretty amazing. In this record, they don't have anybody in school, and then later they do. So I thought that was kind of cool. And this last one. So now these are Eastern European Roma coming from Brazil. This record is from, just a moment, please. This is from 1902, August 1902. They're arriving in New York from Brazil. The passengers are listed as natives of Greece, Serbia, or Italy. And this is really hard to read. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to give anybody a copy. Any records I have, I will happily share with you, okay? So this group was not identified as gypsies. There was not an ethnic category for gypsies before about 1892, but after that, they are sometimes listed as being gypsy. But their surnames indicate that they were Romani people, because in this record you have Ivanovic, Elias, Adamovic, Mazkovic, and Jovanovic. All the occupations listed for them, they'll list their occupation, name, birth date. At least two of them, or all the occupations are listed as a laborer, and they did have considerable sums of money. Now remember, coming through Ellis Island at this time, you kind of had to prove that you could be productive. So having some money on you, going to Brazil first, and then maybe trying again later, worked out for these folks. And this is the last record that I have. This is an immigration record from Argentina from 1903. These people also arrived in New York from Buenos Aires. The passengers on this ship, what's interesting is they are listed as gypsy. That's what their origin is listed as, and you actually can see it right there. All of these people. Now, these people were identified as ethnic gypsies from Serbia. There are 30 members of the Stefanovic, Markovic, I don't know how to say the other one. I'm sorry, I'm Serbians in the room, I'm sorry. But they said they were going to join Jovan Markovic in Boston or Rango Markovic in San Francisco. Yeah. So what's interesting about this is, which I don't have time to talk about, but maybe we can talk about in the discussion, is that there are Roma from these groups who have done DNA tests, who are interested. Amanda and me and another person have a DNA Romani study group on family tree DNA. And GEDmatch. So anyway, what we're doing is we can trace genetically these people to people in the United States, to people in Brazil, to people in Argentina, to people in Europe. So we're definitely all more connected than we even realize, which is, I think, also a step towards working together and knowing each other and knowing that, you know, we're a global family, global nation. So anyway, thank you. I'm really sorry that I've
No, that was great. Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. That was absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to turn now, I believe, to Alexandra and ask her. Alexandra is a Romani attorney. Her last name is Opria, and she is also based in the United States.
Okay. So
Please
hi.
join me in welcoming you.
Thank you to the FXB Center and to Jackie and Magda and CU for having me here today. I wanted to start by saying that chances are that many people in this room, unless you're Roma, don't know other Roma, have not gone to school with other Roma, at least as far as they know. Haven't worked, haven't had Roma coworkers. Oh, this? Better? 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 So, I had always wondered myself, having gone through the school system, why there's so few Roma, or why I thought there were so few Roma in the US. And I came to realize that there was a deliberate racial project that controlled the types of immigrants that came to the US, and Roma were also part of this. And that's one facet. The other facet is the American Roma, whom the government essentially has driven into hiding, and historically kept on the run with anti-Roma laws and such. I wanted to try to place Roma in the broader racial discourse, especially at this tumultuous time in our nation's history, where we have rhetoric basically that's full of bigotry and calling Mexicans criminals, Muslim bans, references to shithole countries. We are living in a really, really dangerous time. And I think that it's important to try to sort of include Roma in the broader discourses of the criminalization of asylum seekers and also into discourses on racial justice, because they too are racialized. Roma in the US have been racialized since they set foot in this country. So I'm glad Kristen went over some of the earlier patterns of migration of Roma, because that really went to the heart of how some, I think you also discussed how some were rejected, right, so I think that we have this idea, aside from Roma being a mythical creature and the romanticized notions, we have this idea that it's an ethnicity, and we have to be careful with these terms, ethnicity versus race. Roma are a racialized group, and few people know this, and as Kristen was saying, there hasn't been much research in this area, and I wanted to read something. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, in the debate in Congress and the subsequent rejection by President Andrew Johnson, there were several references to Roma as a people of color. This is an address by President Andrew Johnson, 1866, that basically rejected the bill, but it was later passed with the 2/3 majority. This provision, he says, comprehends the Chinese of the Pacific states, Indians subject to taxation, the people called gypsies, as well as the entire race designated as blacks, people of color, Negroes, mulattoes, and persons of African blood. So this was the first time that the United States had a civil rights bill on the table. And from the get-go, Roma were seen as non-white. And throughout history, they've been associated with various tropes of criminality. I wanted to focus more on migration of Roma to the United States migration of Roma to the United States, the recent migrants who are my clients, whom I represent. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about American Roma, who, I'm not sure if many of you know that there were such laws as the following on the books. The governing body may make, amend, repeal, and enforce ordinances to license and regulate gypsies. That was a New Jersey statute. After the passage of this act, it shall be unlawful for any gypsies to settle within the limits of any country of the state. I believe the last law was taken off the books in the 90s by Christine Todd Whitman. Any person may demand of gypsies that they shall produce their license. If they shall refuse to do so, he shall seize all the property in possession of such gypsies. That was the Pennsylvania statutes. Gypsies in the state of Maryland must pay jurisdictions a license fee of $1,000 before settling or doing business. When any gypsy is arrested, all his property and the property of any members of the group with whom he's traveling can be confiscated and sold to pay court fines. Sheriffs are paid a $10 bounty for any gypsy they arrest who winds up paying the fee. So there's this notion in the United States that Roma are nomadic. And in my opinion, what I've written about is that there's been a compulsory nomadicization of Roma. So when you have these types of laws where not only is it not okay to be Roma, it's not okay to settle in certain towns. There's literally a price to be paid. I want you to think about that. There's literally value in not being Roma, right? And in not identifying as Roma. So it's no surprise that Roma in the United States have been largely off the radar in terms of racial justice discourses and organizing and advocacy, because it's safer to be under the radar. Now, that doesn't mean that they're under the radar as far as law enforcement, because they're gypsy sheriff units. I've read court documents where, for instance, a Syrian family was mistaken for a gypsy and, profiled as such, and the court basically says, well, it was an honest mistake because gypsies are usually shoplifters. Sort of in passing. Not important, okay. And so this is the landscape that my clients are basically, who are Romanian Roma seeking asylum in the United States from persecution in Romania. This is the sort of backdrop that they are coming into when they're dealing with ICE and when they're dealing with the enforcement and removal operations and when they come before judges in the immigration courts. So one of the first times I encountered this was when I was a law student at UCLA, and community members started coming up to me asking for help with their cases, or I saw them maybe begging on the street. And when I got involved in this type of work, one of the most shocking things to me was seeing people ask for asylum and then being chained, hands to feet, orange jumpsuits, merely because they asked for asylum. This was in 2012, mind you. This was under Obama. Now, it was more of a fluke under Obama that I saw this prosecution for illegal entry. Now, with the zero tolerance policy, the separation of families, prosecutions for illegal entry are much more common. And in case you don't know, that's a criminal, that's a misdemeanor criminal, that's part of a criminal court. You would attend criminal court and be incarcerated in a federal prison for illegal entry, and then you are picked up by ICE. So when you think about it, it's a double jeopardy of sorts. So I'm there in court, and I'm not understanding, what do you mean they're being prosecuted for illegal entry? They didn't try to enter illegally, they asked for asylum, right? You have this notion of the United States as this, city on a shining hill, right, providing light to the rest of the world, or whatever it's been called, which was false, because it was never that, especially to Black Americans and others living in American apartheid here. So it was shocking to see people chained, hands, feet, orange jumpsuits, for merely asking to stay in this country. And what you have to realize is that this is going on right now as we sit here. These arrests have exponentially increased under President Trump and his zero tolerance policy. And children are taken away and sent to Office of Refugee Resettlement. And then they're called unaccompanied minors. Well, guess what? They weren't unaccompanied when they showed up before you arrested their parents. They weren't unaccompanied. And I'm sorry if I sound angry, it's because I am. And people say I should smile more. So that's also a very sexist statement, by the way. Hashtag me too. That women should smile more. How am I doing on time? So there's also a lot of conservative rhetoric on Roma, on these immigrant Roma, right? So you had these anti-Roma statutes, and then Roma sort of went under the radar, but we're still under surveillance by gypsy sheriff's units. And I have to mention that in particular, I learned under the tutelage of Kim Crenshaw about intersectionality. And it's important here to note that Romani women were much more vulnerable to the profiling and to the police arrests in this carceral state that we live in, because they also wore the markers. The American Roma, they had the skirts, and they're in a profession that's marked as a gypsy profession, right? Many are palm readers, right? So, and this criminalization of their livelihood is viewed as, when people think about palm reading, they think about, sort of something fun to do, or some think of it as a scam. This is someone's livelihood, and it's a form of therapy as far as I'm concerned, the way I see it. So the criminalization of livelihood of American Roma is sort of also part of this backdrop. Now enter Romanian Roma en masse, and I want to say 2011, that's just when I, was confronted with the situation. So many, of course, enter and do not have work permits, and so they panhandle. Some panhandle for a living, right? So there are all these professions associated with Roma that, and it becomes normalized as though it's a choice. Well, they want to panhandle. Well, these folks want to tell fortunes and move from town to town. And we don't see the law of the role of the law in shaping sort of opportunities in this country. So numerous Roma came to the U.S. through the 2000s, And in the post 9/11 context, many were welcomed to the US by being placed either in detention or more frequently in alternatives to detention, ATD, which some people call alternative ways of detaining. 1 minute, stop, I'm done. That's it? Shoot. Okay, well, I didn't get to talk about that, but they're in these programs that essentially impose a curfew on Roma, and they're equipped with ankle bracelets. So when you see Roma going around, you see anyone going around with an ankle bracelet, the first thing you think of is this person committed a crime. So automatically, there's an association of asylum seekers with criminality. And it's not just Roma that they're putting ankle bracelets on. It's obviously folks from the triangle to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. And then there's this association with criminality. And I wanted to talk about, really quickly, Tucker Carlson, okay, who's a host on Fox, who did a program on the gypsy invasion of sorts about my clients who had settled in California, Pennsylvania. And there were allegations. I wanted to show the clip, and I debated with myself. I just didn't want to give him the time of day. I didn't want that, toxic message to, you'll be able to see it on YouTube. And I think George Eli, who's here in the audience, was actually on that program, and he was put on the spot of having to answer, well, why do gypsies not want to integrate? Why are they defecating on the streets? Why are they basically unassimilatable? And it's rhetoric that resembles what the Nazis were saying, antisocial, unassimilatable, vagrants, essentially. I have to end, which is super sad, but because I don't get to talk about this at all. And I'm so happy to be in an institution of higher learning where people are thinking about these issues. And it's more important than now that we organize and that there's solidarity and that we act, because what is going on is unacceptable. I have to end, so that'll be that.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you very much. And now, moving on, I'm pleased to introduce Luciano Mares Maia, who joins us from Brazil, where he is the Deputy Prosecutor General, as well as serving as a professor. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I apologize for my English, which is maybe not that good. Let me just state the position, my point of view as an academic from one side. I teach constitutional law and human rights at University of Paraíba, and I am member of the Federal Public Prosecution Service, which is in Brazil, according to the Constitution, not only the institution which deals with legal criminal lawsuits, but also defend human rights. So it's a quite interesting balance, because on the one side, it defends society against criminality, but at the other side, tries to help build the social tissue of and the protection for the disadvantaged ones. So from 28 years until now, I have been working with gypsies. And now I am the Vice Prosecutor General in the Republic of Brazil. I'm second to Mrs. Raquel Dodge, which is our Prosecutor General. And quite by chance is here also in Harvard today to discuss religions and the state. It's another panel in the so-called Brazilian conference, something like that. Well, Ciganos is the label used in Brazil referring to ethnic groups self-ascribed as Calon and Rom, gypsies or Roma. This is also the name by which they call themselves when interacting with surrounding society and government officials. So they use the name Ciganos in Brazil, they themselves. Deported from Portugal as a commutation of death penalty for keeping nomadism, refusing to settle down, gypsies groups are reported to have been sent to Brazil, by the time still a Portuguese colony, from 1686 on. Although Brazil has periodically gathered data on its population, the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBGE, has never included the Gypsies as a group deserving specific identification. Brazilian census leaves Gypsies uncounted and unidentified. Therefore, although there is a verifiable presence of Gypsies groups widespread all over the country, there is no official data as how many they are, where they live, how they live, and how do they do for a living. Brazil is a federative state with the federal union, a federal district, Brasilia, 26 member states, 5,570 municipalities. Wow. Each federative political entity has its sphere of constitutional competence to plan, design, and enforce public policies, envisaging the full implementation of economic, social, and cultural rights. Such competence encompasses policies addressing schooling, housing, health and sanitation, social assistance, exemplo gracia. For example, the Ciganos, the Roma, have all justiciable constitutional, economic, social, and cultural rights as recognized to any other non-Ciganos Brazilians. In Brazil, Brazil is party to all human rights treaties, both in the United Nations system and in the Inter-American system. And in our constitution, there are several economic and cultural rights like housing, right to food, education, which are justiciable. You can rely to courts to make them be enforced. Nevertheless, the Ciganos remain unseen, unheard, uncounted, unassisted, and unprotected by Brazilian authorities, partly due to non-inclusive policies, when not overtly racist and discriminatory approaches and profiling, partly due to the gypsy way of life, nomadic or semi-nomadic, avoiding confrontation with surrounding society, keeping a sort of social invisibility. Such a plurality of public authorities on one hand, and a diversity of scattered gypsies groups on the other hand, make a tough combination against this minority. Unlike indigenous people and even quilombolas, members of a rural black community, who have governmental agency, FUNAI for indigenous peoples and Fundação Cultural Palmares for the black population, rural communities, to deal with issues relating to them, there is no such a public agency to deal with gypsies' demands and claims. Life is lived at local level. Although federal and state governments may design policies and develop social programs aimed at minorities groups, gypsies amongst them, local authorities have to get involved, which require periodically renewed efforts as mandates last 4 years. Every 4 years, we have change in all municipalities, and many times programs are discontinued, so you can start all again trying to build the knowledge on the issue and trying to keep a political will on the issue. Having a nomadic life, or being perceived as having a nomadic life, has a strong impact on the fulfillment of all human rights by the gypsies. It all starts with a birth certificate, due to be issued by a notary based on the place of birth within a certain period of time after the delivery of the baby. As gypsies move on with their newborn children, the notaries of the new place often raise questions, and the children are left unregistered, undocumented. Birth certificate is required as a proof of civil existence, and from it all other documents derive: identity card, driving license, marriage certificate, enrollment in schools, application for social programs, electoral enlisting, etc. Gypsy nomadism in Brazil is assumed to be a basic feature for all gypsies groups and communities, despite the fact that many of them have settled and live in houses or in ranches, barrack camps, tents, or houses. Such assumption of being nomadic has a severe and lasting impact upon them. A fixed address is required to the enjoyment of several economic and civil rights. Also, voting rights requires residence in the constituency of the candidate. To benefit from social programs, one must prove residence with zip code. It's such simple as that, but in their range, they do not have a zip code, they cannot register for anything, no social program. So it's just hard to understand, but that's the way it works there. The absence of a fixed address has also tremendous impact on pre-trial detention. According to Brazilian Criminal Procedure Code, widely enforced by all courts, preventive detention may be warranted in order to avoid that the alleged suspect escape or run away from the district of guilt. In many cases, suspicion against gypsies does not require proof of evidence. Stereotypes prevail, as their very way of life would testify against them. Despite a blatant racist view, to a great extent shared by society at large, Roma, Ciganos, Gypsies are not among the huge figures of offenders that face law and order enforcement agencies. Despite they are assumed to be offenders, there are no criminal cases against Gypsies in general. So it's the prejudice is more in the mind of people than in the facts of society, the acts that would amount to a response from society. The lack of tailor-made policies addressing Roma claims, and despite the statistic on the issue, they remain like pariahs, outcasts, living in the outskirts of cities and villages without security of tenure of the land they live, without tapped water or sanitation, with their children out of school without benefits from social security. Illiteracy is very high among Roma in Brazil, and their mother tongue Romani or Caló, which serves as boundaries and a means to self-protection, is suffering from the fact that the elderly are having difficulties to transmit it to the new generations, with a severe risk of losing words and expressions. As a member of the Federal Public Ministry, an institution in Brazil constitutionally in charge of the legal defense and protection of minorities' rights, including Ciganos, Gypsies, since 1991, we have been working with Ciganos communities, fostering awareness to Gypsy claims and pressing for public policies tailored to address Gypsy interests and rights. It all started with what we call in Brazil a public civil inquiry, a legal instrument that allows the public federal ministry to start an investigation on facts on alleged violation of rights, including human rights. The first communities which were contacted were settled in the city of Sousa, in the interior of Paraíba, located in the dry region in the interior of Paraíba. Not much has changed since then. Living conditions are very harsh, with extreme poverty and food insecurity. The effort to raise awareness made possible that several Ciganos, Gypsies, Roma organizations gather information on the existing groups and start a permanent dialogue with other government actors. In 1996, when the first National Human Rights Program was launched, Roma issues were included in the debate, but did not gather support to be part of the document. When revising the National Human Rights Program, a decree 4,229, issued in May 2002, included some of the Gypsy demands in the second National Human Rights.
May I just stop you just for 1 second? For many people in the room, the use of the word gypsy, I know English is not your first language, is offensive.
Oh, I apologize.
So, and Tigan is similarly offensive. So you're really touching on very important things, on all the structural obstacles that Romani people face in Brazil, as well as many of the cultural beliefs and stereotypes. And I don't want people to miss that part of your discussion because you're using words that are offensive.
I really apologize. Okay. It was not my intention.
Yes, no, I understand. I didn't want to stop to throw you off, but
yes,
now
I understand.
I just had to stop you, so please.
My only concern was that this is also being broadcasted also to Brazil. And there, the expression Roma has no
doesn't
not
mean
this
anything.
doesn't
Maybe
mean
just
anything.
use the Brazilian word then. I don't
Okay,
know. Okay.
I got your point. I will
Yes.
just comply with the situation here, but I just apologize. It was not my intention. I was just trying to clarify the difficulties that we have on being outsiders to name the Roma themselves.
Yes.
So in this national program, it was included some of the duty to promote human rights and freedom from the Roma, and their history and culture and traditions, and also special protection for children, Roma children, also sites and caravan sites and housing rights for Roma communities. So this also would include, as a consequence of this work started in 1991, when for the World Conference Against Racism in 2001, Brazil delegation debated the issues of Roma. And when coming back, it was possible in 2003 to establish the so-called Secretariat for Promotion of Racial Equality Policies, which would include not only black population, but also indigenous peoples and Roma members of communities. And they, in fact, as Mrs. Rita has said, the Roma members of communities have enriched their experiences by living the experiences of black population and black movement and indigenous peoples movement, because they had a strong tradition of struggling for their own rights, so they could exchange experiences and show them the path to get better against Brazilian governments. By now, we have Senator Paulo Paim started in 2012 a debate in Senate proposing a bill organizing the Roma Statute with the economic and social cultural rights for the Roma. So with the Federal Public Ministry, we proposed, and it was, we held a public hearing in the Senate in 2012, when we invited Roma organizations and communities and also public ministries to discuss the Roma claims and also the duty to provide those rights in policies. So this bill is pending approval in the Senate by now.
Well, I hope that it is now able to pass under the current dispensation. Can I just ask you to wrap up? Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Finally, we all know that Brazil has recently is facing a political kickback in social policies.
Yes.
But quite surprisingly, the Gypsies are being the Roma are being referred in the political agenda of the new government in Brazil, and that is, as they do not struggle for land like indigenous people, they do not struggle for land as quilombolas. Yes. Hopefully, there is a space to go forward on this issue by now. I apologize for the expressions used, and I thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe it can come up in discussion. I don't know how much, I don't know enough about the Roma people myself to know the importance of all these words, but it certainly is something that we should be careful about. I'd like to thank you for your presentation, and now I'm going to be turning it to Timia Junghas, who is the Executive Director of the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, coming from Germany. The bios can all be found. That's interesting to hear that there's still room for movement on the website.
Yes.
I will start with the website, if possible, and then the presentation.
Yes, hello. So
You most probably know me as the lady who is obsessed with Roma art, and I will live up to this expectation. So I brought a presentation that focuses on Roma contemporary art. But I am recently, actually, since June 2017, I am a manager, and I am the executive director of the most important baby of the Roma diaspora, the Roma movement. And this is the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture. So imagine that, Germany has the first Goethe Institute or the Cervantes Institute of the Spanish. This tiny institute and most of you know that it has been launched in June 2017 in Berlin. But there is a 4-year-long process that has led up to the birth of the Institute, and many of you have contributed to this birthing process. I am not talking only about the Alliance for ERIAC. I'm also talking about how many Roma intellectuals, politicians, scholars, public speakers, artists all around the globe strengthened the discourse and convince their governments and convince their speakers, just tiny little statements. I must say, Rita Izsák, for example, leading up to the final discussion with the Secretary General of the Council of Europe at a perfect timing, just a half sentence of how, for example, ERIAC could contribute to the pride and dignity of Roma. Magda Mitaka, including alliance members to the conference who could also indicate how important culture and identity might be for our community. So most of you sitting here, perhaps even just subconsciously, have contributed to the building of this institute, and for us it's a huge honor to work for it. Now, in the first 18 months of its establishment, ERIAC has organized over 120 events. Imagine that, every third day we had an event happening. We engaged over 3,000 Roma contributors. This is very important. We engage contributors. That means most of the time we are not able to pay. So we engage them and convince them to contribute, which is beautiful. Beautiful because we had an audience of over 25,000 people. So Roma and non-Roma allies, supporters, contributors, believers of the Roma cause unite to create the ERIAC events. And funnily enough, ERIAC is taken very seriously. If you visit the ERIAC website, this isn't the ERIAC website yet. So may I request some help? ERIAC.org, like European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, ERIAC.org. You will see that politicians and Roma groups and non-profits, ambassadors are using ERIAC as a space to express their support to Roma. So while we are creating these 120 events per year, we are also posing with politicians and cultural workers and Roma groups and bywalkers who come to see the Institute. I'm not able to click show more, but you will be able to do this. It's also important that when you walk into ERIAC, there's the ERIAC logo, and next to the Council of Europe and the Open Society Foundations, you will see the Alliance for the European Roma Institute. Roma themselves have contributed with their own resources and with their own efforts to create this institute. And we are on equal value with these gigantic supporters like the Council of Europe and the Open Society Network. So I must say that with the founding of the first transnational European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, Roma artists, scholars, public intellectuals, and activists are now considering what are the empowering and inspiring methodologies for transgenerational knowledge transfer, where are the counter archives, and whom are the agents of this profound transformation. And I bring you the Roma art discourse, the visual art discourse, of which I feel most comfortable in. I'm still the expert, a little rusty one, but I try. So, no. Yes, I'm looking for the PowerPoint. I'm not
not able to put this down.
And as the sort of undisciplined moderator, I have to apologize to the speakers who are coming now. I'm going to have to ask you to limit your time because otherwise the discussants will have no time and you as an audience will have no time. So once the PowerPoint is up, I'm doubtful that you'll be able to show the entire thing.
Okay. It's difficult to talk about art without images. But I can try.
That's true.
I've never done it before, but let's try. Okay, this must be it. This has my name. So I am starting actually from 1490, just a few slides to orientate you. And I apologize from those of you who have heard these parts from my never finished PhD, but let's start with this. So I am saying that already, Roma image in art history, we can, researching the Roma image in art history, we can conclude that the Roma the imaginarium which condenses Roma into the iconography of the stranger, and these are the Roma strangers in front of a city gate, and pagan, non-Christian or Hayton, and alien and thief, and ugly, and the palm reader, and pickpocketer already developed in the 15th and 16th century. The art historical analysis into the depiction of Roma calls our attention to the fact that today's prevailing stereotypes already formed in the 15th century. And why am I saying this? So perhaps we need to acknowledge that prejudice and racism is so deeply woven and entangled in European history and memory that we cannot expect change and impact from projects, decades, initiatives conceptualized to fight stereotypes and prejudice against the Roma unless we plan for a 600-year time period. The visual system or scopic regime of the later centuries continue to reproduce the subordinate position of Roma in European societies. So we find that studying the art of the 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe and their panoptic regime of modernity, Roma become dependents of Western Europe's African and Asian primitives. So examining the archaeology of these images, we can demonstrate that Central and Eastern European societies create their own black through wild groups and individuals, and primarily through their own local Roma colonies. What I mean is Central European artists do not travel to Aix-en-Provence to find their primitives or Tahiti. They travel to the closest Roma settlement. So they go to Szolnok or they go to Cluj and so on. And this means that the visual production forced Roma into the conceptual ghetto of the gypsy outcast. This is a 2015 visit to a flea market in Central Europe, to the Eceri flea market. While my mother was looking at rugs, I collected the gypsy girls. So the visual remains very definitive. I have 3 minutes, really. So in the second part of the 20th century, finally, Roma artists start to claim authorship. And yes, in the 1971 conference, Roma authors already addressed the issue of documents and poetry and writing that has been appropriated from them. There are over 2 million photographs of our Roma ancestors in European archives. State archives, which preserve and treasure almost exclusively the names of the ethnographers and photographers, and sometimes they are very offensive or ill-intentioned. I picked for you Alfred Ruman, who was a self-made anthropologist and ethnographer with a passion to photograph brown nipples, and this is one of the reasons why after the war he has traveled and photographed Roma passionately. So since the first Roma Congress, hundreds of exhibitions, performances, artworks, construct and small poetry and small writing and small cultural theory has constructed a long hidden and unknown genealogy. Building the chronology of these cultural events, we may tell the story, or more courageously saying, the history of Roma art. In this sense, the notion of Roma art is built from our most precious moments of celebrating Roma creativity in the Roma cultural movement of the past 4 decades. So when you consider our own cultural heritage fragmented, you have to think about it's an oppressed genealogy, and every single little piece of flyer contributes to this oppressed and untold history.
I'm going to need to thank you I'm very sorry to interrupt, but please, I think it was very powerful images. I know you have an entire paper, but I'm mindful of time and also the importance that there be some downtime for all of you to talk amongst each other. Thank you, Timia. Now, our last speaker, before we move to the discussant, is Dafina Savic. And I think it's appropriate that we began with looking at those shipping manifolds and the logbooks with the Serbian surnames, and now turn to Savic.
As the PowerPoint said, just brief anecdote.
No, it's not on. Wait a second.
Very briefly, an anecdote. Our family last name is in fact Shahin, which is a typically recognizable Roma family last name. But in order to be able to access documentation, such as passports, in the former Yugoslavia, my grandfather had to change our last name to a typically known Serbian last name, which is Savic, hence why my last name is Savic. So that being said, I don't know if the presentation is working. Is it working? Yeah. Yes. First and foremost, Tavin Bachtalis Asteveste Romale, Voyasala Shasa Arakautume, wishing you all wellness today. In Romani language, when we greet people, we greet them saying that we are finding you today, we are gathered in goodwill. Unfortunately for Roma, lack of will is what explains the socioeconomic situation and the human rights situation of most of the Roma populations, not only in Canada, but across the world. The inspiring speeches of both Magda and Rita, as I was sitting in the, I must say, very comfortable chairs in the front, compelled me to reorient my entire presentation and really to talk about how we can improve the situation, because I believe that we are all aware about the gross human rights violations of Roma. But out of respect for a discussant, I decided to control myself and not do that and attempt to address the points I wanted to address by looking at the human rights situation of Roma Canada and how it has evolved and what is the historical impact we often talk about on the situation of Roma in Canada. So Canada is probably the last country we think of when we think about Roma, let alone when we think about human rights violation, because of the reputation of Canada and the international scene as being a country who respects human rights. And I must say to that point that the indigenous population of Canada today remains one of the most still persecuted populations, and whose human rights situation in a country like Canada must be more visible and needs to be not only visible, but also concrete actions need to be done in that regard. And as an organization working in Canada, this is a solidarity we really share with Indigenous peoples. And in the spirit of solidarity, I thought it was important to mention that. That being said, so Roma have been present in Canada as early as the 1800s and possibly even earlier. So Roma in Canada, in fact, constitute one of the oldest, if we can say that way, multicultural groups that are really part of the Canadian multicultural mosaic. In fact, Roma in Canada have been led a very invisible life, which in a sense has contributed to their emancipation, but on the other hand also contributed to the maintenance of discrimination, to the erasure of that identity. And I will attempt in less than 10 minutes to speak to that a little bit. So just to go back, the Canadian context, and this picture essentially sums it up. And essentially, so as I mentioned, Roma have been in Canada for over 200 years, and if not more. And when speaking about history, what is interesting is that we often don't think about the Canadian context in relation to the European one when we think about Roma, but in fact, the Canadian demographic, where we have, we mentioned the discrepancy in terms of population. The unofficial estimates of Canada for the Roma population varies between 80 to 100,000 people, whereas according to the census, the latest census, only 4,000 Roma self-identified as Roma. So we clearly see the impact of invisibility, and one of the main reasons, in fact, why there is a discrepancy is because of fear. So fear of reprisal, fear of discrimination. So Roma will not tend to self-identify as Roma because most Roma who came to Canada, in fact, came to run away from the discrimination, but also from the very identity. And many Roma went to the extent of learning a foreign language such as Turkish in order to pass for Turks in Canada, rather than to reclaim that identity, who has been the reason for the discrimination, and unfortunately remains one of the main reasons. So that's just an interesting aspect to think about. And also, many of the Roma who came to Canada, in fact, came as a result of the abolishment of slavery in Europe. So that's when we saw, in fact, many of the first Roma coming to Canada. So when we think about the global context, it is important to understand the impact of history in the Canadian context when regard to Roma. And so going back to that picture, you probably have a lot of questions. Essentially, despite the fact that Roma have also faced many of the same elements Christine mentioned in the Americas, in the context, there's always, I always say, wherever there is Roma, there has been discrimination. There's not, I believe, a single country in this world that has a Roma population where that population has equal status both in meaning but in reality. So there has been, but perhaps the difference with the Canadian context is that the discrimination of Roma is very political, if we can say it that way, and is mostly related to immigration policies. So this began really in 1997 as a result of many Czech Roma who were coming to Canada as a result of the rise of the far right and many acts of violence in 1997 in the Czech Republic. But perhaps more documented is the situation in 2012, whereby if you have a few seconds to just take read some of the words on this PowerPoint. These Roma are bogus refugees. Gypsy refugees pose a risk to Canadian police, say, of an influx. So these are words, Roma are bogus refugees, of Canadian Minister of Immigration at the time, Minister Jason Kenney, speaking about Roma who, in fact, came to seek asylum from countries such as Hungary and the Czech Republic, really shortly after the rise of the far right, 3 minutes, in Hungary, where in fact it was shortly after the killing Magda mentioned this morning, and the anti-Roma marches in Hungary, in Slovakia, in the very well documented segregation of Romani children in schools. So many Roma, believing Canada to be a country where human rights are accepted, went to Canada, as the situation in Europe is more or less similar to the extent of human rights. So many sought asylum in Canada. As a result of that, unfortunately, the Canadian government responded by saying that Roma are bogus refugees, again, related to that perception of Roma, linking Roma to criminality, and were targeted as cur jumpers coming to Canada to abuse of the social welfare system. And shortly after that, there was a policy that was enacted under Bill C-31, where Roma were faced with, there were specific measures and policies put in place in order to restrict the acceptance of Roma asylum seekers in Canada, and this is well documented, so the graph you see here. So since the introduction of the Bill C-31 in 2012, we have seen a decrease of the acceptance of Roma of 90%. And this is documented in the context of a study that was carried in Canada. So we really see the impact of the policy on Roma asylum seekers, which was really based off of a rhetoric of Roma being criminals, which we see today. And of course, I don't have time right now to go into details about the policies and impacts and some of the other elements, but I'm happy to discuss it after. And I just want to talk about the impact. And the picture here is a case actually we worked on, a deportation case. Unfortunately, the family was not deported after we carried a campaign to stop their deportation, which scheduled 4 times. And the young girl in the picture was 17 at the time, and she was to be deported. And in fact, it's just to gain an understanding that Canada also needs to be held accountable to human rights standards and treaties which has ratified, referring to the treaty, the 1951 Treaty on the Convention of Refugees, whereby the Canadian government, in fact, deported many Roma asylum seekers back to situations of discrimination and persecution, which is against the Convention of Refugees that the Canadian government ratified. And in fact, Canada contributed to the double discrimination of Roma, because the Roma who were sent back were mostly sent back in countries where Roma children were already segregated, and going back to those countries, their education they had in Canada was not recognized, and when they went back to countries like Hungary, they were placed, we had 17-year-olds like this girl here who would have been placed in elementary school at 17 years old with children at the age of 10. So of course that stopped their education. So when we talk about equal opportunities, the Canadian government contributed to reducing the chances of equal opportunities by adopting this policy and deporting back Roma to situations of persecution. And in 1 minute, you have them here, because I knew this would happen. So these are some concrete recommendations addressed both to the international community about concrete ways that we can implement policies that will actually lead to change. And if I just have 30 seconds to say, one of the most important one is to include Roma in processes that concern them, because that is the way forward. That is the only way we can have policies, yes, that will lead to change, is if Roma are included in the processes that help build those policies. And one of the failures so far is that policies are actually oriented at the wrong targets, the wrong problems. And we often, when we speak about education, we speak about Roma need to be educated, fair enough, but if the school is segregated, it is a little difficult to be educated. So I think we need to shift the dialogue, we need to reverse the dialogue, but also reverse the power of imbalances history has taught us and has in fact created, if we want real change to actually happen. And to people who are not in positions of power but are everyday citizens, you can do something. You can. Social media is how we managed to stop the deportation. So Twitter, use Twitter, tag your governments, write to your members of parliament, know your political systems, use the means you have to actually affect change. And right now, you can tweet. So follow us on social media, follow Roma activists on social media, support their initiatives, support their actions, because it is not true that we cannot do anything about situations. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for keeping your remarks more or less to time. We're about half an hour behind schedule, everyone, just to be clear. So it's my pleasure to turn over the challenging task of being a discussant for these many rich and important presentations to Belén Rodriguez de Alba, who comes from the UN High Commission for Human Rights. Thank you for joining us here. The UN has been an incredibly important forum, I should just point out, in which to turn many national issues into ones of international concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's not an easy task to find the linkages from all these very interesting presentations. We have heard from ranging from the recognition, I will start by order, the historical representation and misrepresentation of Roma in the US by Christine Raisi. After that, we went to the criminalization, I think, of Roma asylum seekers in the US, the recognition of Ciganos in Brazil and the protection of their economic, social, and cultural rights, how education and methodologies for transgenerational knowledge transfer are important to understand the past and the present of Roma history and people, from Timea, and finally the situation or violations of human rights of Roma communities in Canada. I was thinking, I put together some reflections before coming here, and after listening to all these presentations, I would say that to have as a staff of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I think that to have a human rights work or based approach to Roma and to defend the human rights of Roma and minority rights, one needs to understand history, anthropology, culture, and I am tempted to ask our High Commissioner to put us all to work on all those subjects to be able to carry out our mandate in a proper way. But I would like to say that one of the most, or the commonalities in all your presentations has been invisibility. And I think invisibility is also a form of anti-Gypsyism, because this invisibility is also purposefully. And you know that in Europe, anti-Gypsyism has been recognized, is a worldwide term used by Rita as the former rapporteur on minority issues in her reports, but also in resolutions of the European Union as a form, insidious and particular form of racial discrimination. So I think invisibility is also part of that, of anti-Gypsyism. So I think that in order to fight against the subconscious societal consensus, but also deliberate consensus to exclude Roma, and to combat their discrimination and social exclusion, to combat stereotypes created and reinforced through popular literature, the media, the arts, the language through centuries, that we've seen in those very interesting pictures and photographs. It is, first of all, essential to educate mainstream societies about the diversity of Roma, their history, culture, and the forms, extent, and severity of anti-Gypsyism, and what they face in their daily lives. And I think we have Mr. Eli, who will talk about his movie later on. It is essential also to come up with a counter-narrative, to consider active, meaningful, social, economic, political, and cultural participation by Roma, as Rita also mentioned, as a key to tackling anti-Gypsyism, and created mutual trust for the benefit of the whole society. 10 days ago, during the Roma week, there was a very interesting hearing at the European Parliament. I can see some Roma activists who were there and are here today. And there is a member of the European Parliament who's a Roma, Soraya Post, who is pushing for truth and reconciliation processes in Europe to combat anti-Gypsyism. And she was explaining how Roma communities in Europe, they don't put their children in school, not because they don't believe in education, but because they are afraid that their children will be excluded, bullied, etc. So, and that this truth and reconciliation processes is a matter of trust between the majority society and between Roma communities. And I think that, and one interesting thing that was shared at the European Parliament was about the experiences in Latin American truth and reconciliation processes, whether tackling directly indigenous peoples such as Canada, the US, Guatemala, but also in processes where indigenous peoples were not at the core of the discussion, but were addressed, injustices and grievances, and how these experiences can inform all those processes that are being discussed in Europe. So I think that because of this invisibility of Roma people in the Americas is so rampant, you tend to think that in Europe there are processes you can learn from, but there are also processes in the Americas that Europeans are learning from and that you can learn from as well, from other communities, Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples, which have pushed the agenda, at least on the international level, and in some cases at the national level, like in the case of Colombia, where they have a very interesting legislative framework. You can learn from those. I'm going to be very short. I think it is also key for states to take full responsibility for the Roma communities. I was mentioning citizens, but in many occasions they are not citizens, and the issue of statelessness has not been mentioned, but it is Roma communities that have been in countries for centuries. There are second, third generations, and yet stateless. I think much can be achieved through recognition of cultural contributions of Roma, positive initiatives, and I think maybe to learn from the decade for the protection of people of African descent could be an interesting way of bringing visibility. And I have put together some questions for the speakers, for the panelists here. I wanted to say that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has observed, and in connection to the presentation of my colleague from the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, that dissemination of hate speech and that incite to discrimination against certain groups of individuals, and here I'm particularly mentioning Roma, is substantiated on the basis of the defense of national identity, security, criminalization of immigration, the context of the economic crisis, the principle of national preference, or that our nationals first, and the public linkages between security and migration. So I had a question for Alexandra in her experience with the work with asylum seekers. To what extent those that are asylum seekers, but also those who are perceived as foreigners, are presented as a threat to security, and how this could have an increase in the discourse of hate speech, racial discrimination, and subsequently an impact maybe on eventually hate crimes, which we are observing in Europe. I have a very short question for Mr. Maris. You have a census in 2020 in Brazil. And how you think it could be ensured that there is a demographic category for Roma people. For Timea, how do you think that Roma history and contributions of Roma culture could be better acknowledged and promoted in order to construct or reconstruct a positive and inclusive Roma identity? Because I think now more than ever to come up with a counter narrative is key. And maybe to Christine, but to anybody else who would like to answer this, how do you think that traditional and new media, including maybe most importantly social media, could contribute to promote these non-stereotypical portrayals of Roma, bringing more visibility of self-representation and again countering the narrative? Thank you.
Those are the questions?
Yes.
Yes. And Rita, you wanted to make a comment, or do you? We're going to, should we, let's take the questions from the discussant first and then turn to the audience. Thank you. So I think the first up was you, Alexandra.
I think your question was about asylum seekers being portrayed as a threat to security and sort of how Roma fit within that narrative. Absolutely. I think that there's been a militarization of immigration policy because asylum seekers have, started to be portrayed as a threat. The invasion. If you see if you watch Fox News, which I try not to, but sometimes I need to research something. There's this narrative about the silent invasion. And so, you have Mexicans on one side who are criminals and rapists and part of MS-13 who are invading and are a threat to our security. Then you have the Islamophobic narrative, right, that, we have the Muslim ban because they're all terrorists. And Roma fit somewhere in there, but the threat is conceived differently. It's not so much violence. There's been admission that Roma don't commit, even Tucker Carlson was saying, look, they don't commit violent acts, but what they're doing by rejecting our culture is hostile, is a hostile act. So a type of cultural violence that Roma are committing. And of course, it's tied to security threats. That's why we're putting people in detention. That's why we're spending billions of dollars. For fiscal year 2019, $2.8 billion is going to be spent on detaining immigrants. $2.8 billion. And that's not counting the, 184 million that's spent on the Alternatives to Detention program, where you are equipped with an ankle monitor. Without regard to whether you're sick or, it might make you more prone to blood clots or things like that. So there's definitely this narrative about the immigrant threat and the invasion.
Thank you. And next was to you.
Yes,
Quite a specific question.
Yeah, Brazil will have another census next year, 2020. We invited IBGE to discuss these issues, and they told us that they were not prepared to put ethnicity as a category. So Roma are not discussed on and not will not be counted as such. We only count colors, black, yellow, still yellow, yes, white people. So you have to introduce purple, yes, yeah, and browns, yes. So what we tried to do in the meanwhile is a kind of survey with a direct question to the municipalities, which are 5,570 municipalities, demanding them to inform about the presence of Roma in their area, so we can address particularly policies at the local level. That's what we're trying to do. But we do not have, and we will not have next year. So they have not developed the category to inform ethnicity in our census.
It makes me realize that I don't know whether the U.S. Census, which will also be held in 2020, never has. Yes.
It has before. It has at one point.
In the past, but not. Can I just let the panel answer all of their questions, and then I'll turn it to the audience. I think, Kristen, were you next? Or was it?
It was me.
It was you. Sorry, that means, yes.
So the question of how to make an efficient intervention in the field of Roma culture, and I mean, this is well researched, well published already, so we need to make a positive intervention into the Roma image, fight stereotypes, or exaggerate them to the extent that they are creatively making an intervention. We trust our artists, and we can trust the notion of Roma art. So already it is an intervention if you claim. It's a stance and a claim. We need to celebrate Roma creativity and claim all the precious moments of our cultural history. So know that every single little thing added to this cultural history that we did, an exhibition speech, a short poem, an important text that you consider part of this history creates the oppressed genealogy of our Roma cultural history. And then, yes, a counter visual against anti-Gypsy and neo-fascist visual, because neo-fascists have a propaganda machine which comes with the visuality. So our artists and our scholars and our creatives need to fight the fascist visuality. And we do not need to argue for the legitimacy of Roma arts and culture at all. It is our cultural right. and it needs to be recognized and fulfilled. We don't need an argumentation or a scholarly theory in order to have access to cultural production, representation, and access to majority institutions in order to produce our own culture and have access to it and even the next generations to be able to access this arts and cultural heritage.
Thank you. And then the last question, I believe, was to you, Kristen.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. So about using traditional and new media to bring more visibility and a counter narrative. So I think that there's a couple ways that that can happen, and one of them is what Defina shared for human rights activism, mobilizing people using social media to get the word out to people who might be able to influence policies and also create awareness about situations that are happening in different countries. I also try not to get my news from Fox News, but sometimes I do get news from different platforms that people are using from different organizations in various countries to see what's going on there. And if I want to know what's going on somewhere, I can go to a website, or I'm going to just admit it, even Facebook sometimes. But there are different ways that you can engage with media to find out current happenings. But as I said in my own presentation with a historical perspective, I really think that we need to start documenting that as for our own purposes, to know, where our diaspora has been, what our collective history is, what our connections to each other are, but also to show that there is a counter narrative, as she talked about. That yes, there's all these stereotypical narratives, but what is our real history? Like, that's what I want to help preserve and promote and share. So that's the short answer, because I know some of you want to ask questions too, so go ahead.
So I'm going to allow one comment from Dafina, who didn't get a question. Then short comment.
Yeah.
And then, yes.
Yeah,
Dafina.
well, thank you. I think the title of this conference is very fitting, Neglected Voices. I think that's why we're all rushing to say everything we ever wanted to say about Roma in 10 minutes. And especially Roma women, you rarely get a space and a captive audience. So bear with us as we try to literally say everything we ever wanted to say about Roma while we're here. So having said that, I just want to say two things briefly. I think for me, what important thing to do is to stop fighting stereotypes. And I say that because when we talk about human rights, I mean, the right of Roma to existence, the right of Roma to be protected from violence, from women not to be sterilized, from children not to be placed in ghettos, in segregated schools, has nothing to do with stereotypes. It has nothing to do with whether or not Roma are nomads or still children or whatever stereotypes you may have about Roma. So we need to change our defense strategy. We need to stop being defensive. We need to start claiming our rights, our basic human rights to exist as a people and to exist with dignity as a people. So I encourage you all to use social media to change that narrative. And in social media, I really mean it. We did a tweet last week to the Canadian ambassador to Bulgaria, which led to a meeting by the Canadian Embassy to the Bulgarian minister regarding the hate speech and the violence in Bulgaria, which I haven't read the email yet, but I got it this morning, and there's been results to that meeting. So social media is huge in a tool. We also are leading a campaign to get the Canadian government to recognize the Romani genocide, which there was a statement that the genocide was recognized, but there still need to be actions when we have an active parliament. So I encourage you all to use social media to get your messages across and tag representatives of government or ambassadors when you do, because it does make a difference. And traditional media is one of the biggest tools to increase the visibility of the neglected voices of Roma. So if you're a journalist, write about it. If you're not a journalist, write to your reporters, write to your media, get them to cover situations of Roma which don't get visibility. And I'll stop it there.
Thank you. All right, hands are bursting. I'll take 3 questions, and then I'll ask for guidance from the conference organizers. I don't know you by name. I'm pointing to you in the stripe. Well, stripe doesn't help me, really. Stripe
I just want to pick up a point where the gentleman from Brazil mentioned about the census in 2020.
Yes.
In the UK, there's going to be another census coming up. And from my experience dealing with families who've needed help in terms of doing application forms, etc., for governmental subsidies, etc., there's always a census question there which asks, do you come from an ethnic minority, Afro-Caribbean, Indian, Gypsy, Roma, or traveller community? And it's also going to be put onto the next census in the UK. So I don't see why there's an issue of putting the Roma in Brazil within that census. Why does it have to be labelled for their skin colour? That's my question.
Okay, that's somebody taking notice. I'm going to take 3 questions. But, all right, next to striped shirt.
Yeah. My question is for Tamia. And I'm George Eli, the founder of the Romani Media Initiative. I think we know each other. Yes, Tamia. My question is, you showed some beautiful art, but it also was quite offensive and oppressive art, although important. And I remember when my son was in school and he was showed a very famous painting that hangs in the New York Museum today of a gypsy woman pickpocketing. I say gypsy because it's called that. And he was very embarrassed about it. And they talked about that it was such a beautiful and expensive painting. Is there something that your organization is doing to help museums talk about this is oppressive art, although beautiful, we understand important, but it's oppressive art. Is there something being done about that? That's my question.
Thank you. And one last one, Rita. I'll give you the...
Yeah, it's interesting because I did want to have the same question on the census, and now thank you for bringing it up. Brazil has been leading on data and disaggregated data. It's among the very few countries, together with the UK, the US, and India, which actually does data collection. And I got commitment in my last discussions with the Brazilian government to actually collect data. So I do encourage you again, and I will also take it up officially now, to still include Roma into the data. And there was a mapping in 2013. And it resulted in like Roma being in 21 states and 337 municipalities, but it doesn't really, it doesn't reflect, I think, the reality. So just one thing is about encouraging this, and I will take it up from my official position for sure. And if you allow me a comment, I know we have teachers with...
I thought that was a comment, actually. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, on Brazil, just one more thing. You mentioned the senator, Paim, who tabled a statute on Roma. And I just wanted to highlight this to the audience because I think it's really interesting that Brazil has a Senate which has 81 members. The society is composed by 52% of black and brown people. There is one man in the Senate who is black. And this is the same senator who tabled the resolution on Roma. And I think this is so critical because you see when you have one person who goes through the same experience, how it can help others. And I think we should not leave this out of the discussion, that the only one black member in the Senate is the one who is committed to the Roma cause in Brazil. And then I would have just one question to Kristen. It's amazing what you do, and really kudos, because it's such a difficult work. And my question is, have you ever actually come across personally to the people you research? Because you use Ancestry, and so maybe you mentioned, and maybe I missed it, but like, did it happen that you actually research somebody and then you get to meet them, and then you, okay, if you can say something about it.
So, well, did everybody hear her question? Yeah, okay.
So we're going to start with the last question first, okay?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, I do meet people that I research because I see their ancestors, and then I also can see their DNA. And one of the sites that we use, the DNA is public, and some people don't use their real name, but I can email them and ask them if they would like to do a comparison, if they'd like to be included in the study, and a lot of people are interested. So all of the DNA evidence I have, obviously, is from living people. And then I can connect that to their records. So really, one thing that I do want to say, which I think is very important to this conversation and will become more important as time goes on, is that there is no DNA test that's available today that can definitively prove that someone is Roma. That doesn't exist. But if you look at a paper trail of genealogy and you look at the matches that people have genetically, you will find that they all match like this big group of people. You're looking at also to their last names and their occupations, which are also listed on the census. But there isn't one thing that's just a slam dunk on its own. You have to look at the full picture, and then you can connect people. And actually, the Cooper record is Ethel's family in here. And yeah, and you were saying that some of the names that I mentioned probably are your family. Eli and Mark's, that's George's family. So the interesting thing too that we're finding is what I didn't say in my presentation for the German Roma that were here in the 1750s, so that intermarried with Romani Chels. They're completely absorbed into that group. But there are Romani Chels that match Sinti people in Germany today and didn't know how they matched. And the only reason that we found out was because we did a paper trail. Thank goodness American and German records are pretty impeccable. So we were able to trace families and names, and then that's how we found that connection. So, yeah.
So keeping to the reverse order, the question on images and art?
Yes. So while we are very radical thinkers, Roma scholars and artists, the decolonial practice cannot start with reclaiming all the Carmens and all the nomadic people and all the professional, traditional professional representation of us from 1490 until the present day from all European museums, naturally. A public education process by the Institute has started, and this is also a public education process to all of us, because, for example, the images I showed you from Bruegel to Roma are even unknown to our community, or some of the members of our community. I didn't have time to switch into the mode of what our Roma contemporary artists are doing and how they work with this heritage, but the Institute is nurturing this activity of our artists and is keeping in touch on a very high level, trying to be very diplomatic with majority institutions to negotiate the space for our nurtured artists.
Thank you. Do you want to restate your question again? You had the first question, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, in the UK, we will have another census coming up. And previously, before, and my general sort of experience is that when families are applying for particular governmental help, they tend to also ask for information about their ethnicity. And on the paper forms, you always would see whether you come from a Afro-Caribbean background or an Indian background, but they also mention whether you come from a Roma, Gypsy, and a traveller background. What I'm saying is why, as the gentleman there from Brazil mentioned, that the next census in 2020 is not going to include that.
Yes.
And he mentioned that they're just going to do it on the basis of skin color.
On race classification, not ethnicity.
So why is it that we can't do it?
Well, perhaps due to the Brazilian history, which is we just forced the people from Africa as not as people but as animals, as to be, yes. So this brutality is still in our history, and we have not overcome it. So what I may say that we also have a kind of register for social assistance in which it's possible to make such differentiations. And in this register, which we call Cadastro Único, CAD Único in Brazil, it's been possible to inform the ethnicity, being from a Roma family, for instance, and then the policies are addressed specifically. So we are that it's also what I mentioned, that requires a fixed address. And that's for that reason that we are trying to impart information to the government to change the requirement and make them also accept the Roma caravan sites and also barrack camps and things like that. So we are trying to put it forward.
Can I say something about Brazil? So I spent some time there, and Brazil has a very curious history, and it's always brought up to us as sort of, well, look, Brazil is, they didn't have anti-miscegenation laws, so we think of Brazil as a place without racism oftentimes. And during our study, I'm glad Rita brought up the fact that Afro-descendants are very underrepresented in positions of power in Brazil. And what we were looking at is how can you have racism without official races? And they do it by skin tone, texture of the hair, things like that. And I visited Roma in Curitiba. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
And most of them would be, if you only looked at skin tone, it would be problematic because most of them would be classified as white. I'm much lighter than I am. So I understand the difficulties and all that. And the last point I wanted to make is about the need for affirmative action. I'm glad that you mentioned inclusion and how it's not enough to be educated. As we see even in the States with the scandal around the lack of meritocracy and people buying slots into these elite institutions, you need affirmative action in order to take into account structural subordination in order to include minorities in these institutions.
Brazil is a racist country. Yes, it's a racist country. It's a racist country. Absolutely.
I'm from a racist country too.
Yep.
Okay, I think Professor Barber wanted to say something. I'm going to switch the mic around to her. And then, with regret, I'm going to have to thank the panelists and let us have lunch so that everybody can talk to each other without intermediation. Professor Barber.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to do what we call a two...
Thank you for your comments.
A two-finger, which is like, not a one-finger, but two-finger, which is like really is relevant to this discussion. I just want to say this question of the census, I think is more complicated, and I actually agree, and I'm not quite sure what Mr. Meyer's personal view is, but there is, as many of you know, a very heated debate going on in the US at the moment about whether there should be a citizenship question in the census, and many of us are against it. And we're against it because it's going to have a chilling effect on people answering census questions, because being undocumented is such a stigmatized status. And so I think to force people to, to have a question where there is, as you said very well, I think, Defina, a value, a monetary value on going under the radar is maybe not the best strategy, because what you'll get is a radical underrepresentation. And then they'll say, well, we put the census question in there, and look, there are only, 5,000, because many people won't answer. So I'm not sure what the right answer to this question is, but I do think it's more complicated than just saying, obviously we should have a census question on whether you're Roma or not. It may be, and I do think that your point, Luciano, about different histories and different cultures and maybe different kind of senses of racism and stigma in different contexts is a very important one. It isn't a one-size-fits-all. So the situation in the UK, as you describe it, is really one thing. The situation in Brazil may well be different. I don't know it well enough. But I know that here in the US, I think more or less uniformly the left and progressive forces are against the citizenship question, precisely because it's going to militate against minorities actually completing the census.
Well, that's a complicated one, too. We keep finding things that we can discuss more over lunch. So let me just end the panel now and thank the speakers for such a rich discussion, ranging from history and documents to culture to law. A hand for all of them. Thank you.